Somewhere in the fossil record, buried under nearly 2 million years of sediment and silence, is the story of the most successful human species that ever lived. Not us, not Neanderthals, not the mysterious Denisovans. A different kind of human entirely. One that walked out of Africa before any of those species even existed, spread across 3 continents, survived ice ages and volcanic winters and collapsing ecosystems, and kept going, and going, and going. For nearly 2 million years. For context, our species Homo sapiens has been around for maybe 300,000 years. We think of ourselves as the great survivors, the adaptable ones, the ones who made it. But Homo erectus outlasted us by a margin that is almost impossible to wrap your head around. If modern human history were a single hour, Homo erectus would be a full week. So the question that drives everything we're about to explore tonight is simply this. How? How does a species survive that long? What did they have or do or know that kept them alive through climates and catastrophes that erased countless other animals from the planet entirely? The answer isn't one thing. It never is with survival. It turns out to be a combination of factors working together in ways scientists are still untangling. The way their bodies were built for long distances and endurance. The tools they made and kept making and slowly, quietly improved across generations. The food strategies they used, flexible enough to shift when the world shifted around them. The possibility, still debated, that they understood fire in ways no earlier species had. The social bonds that kept small groups of them alive when isolation would have meant death. And something harder to measure, but maybe most important of all, the capacity to learn, to pass knowledge forward, to carry tradition across time, even without language as we know it. That's what this story is about, not just a species, a survival blueprint, one that worked for longer than almost anything else in human evolutionary history. Now, I want to be honest with you up front. This is not a story with clean edges. Homo erectus left behind bones and stones and ash, but not diaries. Not explanations, not intention. So some of what we'll talk about tonight is well-supported evidence. Some of it is the best current interpretation of that evidence. And some of it is genuinely contested, with researchers on different sides making compelling arguments. Where that's the case, we'll say so. The goal here isn't to pretend we know more than we do. It's to trace the shape of something remarkable using every tool science currently has. Before we go any further, if you're listening to this on Spotify, you already know it's ad-free and music-free. If you're not, the link to follow along there is in the description. It's the best way to support what we do here and the cleanest listening experience for falling asleep, which, let's be honest, is probably at least part of why you're here right now. And speaking of that, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I actually read these. There's something genuinely strange and wonderful about the geography of this audience. Someone in Auckland just getting up, someone in Dublin drifting off, someone in Chicago with insomnia at 2 a.m, letting ancient human history carry them somewhere quieter. If that's you, you're exactly who this is made for. Now, back to the story. Homo erectus. The name translates roughly to upright human, which feels almost too simple for a species this extraordinary. They appear in the fossil record somewhere around 1.9 million years ago, possibly earlier, depending on which fossils you include and which researcher you ask. They persist in some form in some part of the world until somewhere around 100,000 years ago, possibly even more recently than that. The timeline itself is part of what makes them so fascinating and so difficult to fully understand. A species that spans that much time, that much geography, that much climate variation, is going to look different depending on where and when you find it. And Homo erectus absolutely does. They were found in Africa, in Georgia in the Caucasus, in China, in Java, in India, in Spain. across a range that no earlier human species had ever come close to achieving. And they did it without boats, without maps, without anything we would recognize as planning in the modern sense. They did it one landscape at a time, following food and water and opportunity across a world that was itself constantly changing beneath their feet. How they managed all of that, the bodies they used, the habits they built, the social structures they lived inside, the way they responded when conditions turned against them, is one of the most compelling stories in all of natural history. And we're going to follow it tonight from beginning to end. So settle in, get comfortable. Let's start at the very beginning, with who Homo erectus actually was, where the first fossils were found, and why scientists spent over a century arguing about what exactly they were looking at. The name Homo erectus first entered the scientific record in the 1890s, when a Dutch physician named Eugène Dubois dug up a skullcap and a thigh bone on the island of Java in what is now Indonesia. He called what he found Pithecanthropus erectus, ape man, upright. He was convinced he had discovered the missing link between apes and humans. The scientific establishment was considerably less convinced. Some said he had found a giant gibbon, others said a deformed modern human. A few agreed with him entirely. The debate lasted decades, and in some ways a version of it is still going on today. That controversy tells you something important about Homo erectus right from the start. This is not a species with a neat, tidy definition. It's a category that scientists have been building, revising, arguing over, and rebuilding for more than 100 years. Some researchers prefer to split the group into multiple separate species, calling African fossils Homo ergaster, calling earlier or later variants by different names entirely. Others prefer to lump them all together under the Homo erectus umbrella, treating regional variation as exactly that, variation within a species rather than evidence of distinct lineages. Neither camp is being unreasonable. The fossils genuinely support both interpretations depending on what you weight most heavily. For tonight, we're going to use Homo erectus in the broader sense, not because the debate doesn't matter, but because the core of what we're exploring, the survival, the spread, the astonishing longevity, holds regardless of where exactly you draw the taxonomic lines. Whether you call the African populations Homo ergaster or early Homo erectus, they're still doing the same remarkable things for the same remarkable stretch of time. And it's the things they did that we're really here to talk about. So what is the time range we're actually dealing with? The oldest fossils that most researchers include in the Homo erectus group appear in the African record somewhere around 1.9 million years ago. Some fragmentary evidence pushes that earlier, to perhaps 2 million years or just beyond, which is why you'll sometimes see that figure used. On the other end, populations in Java appear to have survived until somewhere between 100,000 and 117,000 years ago, though some estimates have placed them even closer to the present. The honest answer is that the exact endpoints are uncertain, which is actually itself part of the story. A species with fuzzy edges in time is often a species that was genuinely actively present across an enormous range of conditions right up until it wasn't. 2 million years. Let's sit with that number for just a moment. The entire stretch of Homo sapiens' existence, from our earliest fossil evidence to right now, fits inside that span roughly 6 times over. The Roman Empire, the entire sweep of recorded history, the agricultural revolution, the building of every pyramid and cathedral and skyscraper, all of that happens in the last tiny fraction of the time Homo erectus was walking around on this planet. They were here before the landscape of East Africa looked the way it does today, before the Mediterranean had its current shape, before a half-dozen major ice ages had come and gone. Calling them long-term survivors is almost an understatement. The fossil evidence for all of this comes from a scattered but remarkably rich set of sites. East Africa is where the earliest and, in many ways, most complete picture comes from. Sites in Kenya, Ethiopia and Tanzania have produced skulls, jawbones, teeth, and postcranial fragments that give researchers a solid baseline for what the earliest Homo erectus populations looked like and how they behaved. The Turkana Basin in Kenya has been especially productive, including the famous Turkana boy, a nearly complete skeleton of a young Homo erectus individual that has told scientists an enormous amount about growth, development, and body proportions. Move northeast and you hit Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia, where a set of fossils discovered in the 1990s and 2000s pushed the known dispersal of Homo erectus back further than almost anyone expected. These Georgian individuals, dated to around 1.85 million years ago, were outside Africa earlier than most models had predicted. They also showed a striking range of variation within a single population, which added significant fuel to the debate about how much internal diversity a species can show before you're really looking at multiple species. The Dmanisi fossils are small-brained by Homo erectus standards, relatively gracile, and yet they made it to the Caucasus. That alone is remarkable. Further east, Chinese sites like Zhoukoudian near Beijing, where so-called Peking man was discovered in the early 20th century, document Homo erectus populations living in temperate, seasonal environments far from any African origin. Zhoukoudian is associated with evidence of fire use, though the interpretation of that evidence has been revised and contested over the years. The Chinese fossil record as a whole suggests Homo erectus populations were present in East Asia for at least 1 million years, possibly longer. And then there's Java, where it all started, scientifically speaking. The Indonesian islands have produced Homo erectus fossils spanning an extraordinary range of dates, from early populations more than 1 million years old, to the late surviving groups that appear to have persisted until well after Homo sapiens had already emerged in Africa. The Javanese fossils tend to be more robust, with thicker skull walls and more pronounced brow ridges, which is part of why some researchers argue they represent a distinct regional variety rather than a single globally uniform species. Either way, their persistence is the point. The evidence we're working from isn't just bones. Stone tools tell a parallel story, sometimes appearing at sites with no human fossils at all, leaving us to infer presence from the marks left behind in rock. The earliest tools associated with Homo erectus belong to what's called the Oldowan tradition, simple but effective flakes and choppers knapped from raw stone. Later, a more sophisticated toolkit appears, the Acheulean, centered on a teardrop-shaped Handaxe that becomes one of the most recognizable objects in all of human prehistory. We'll go deep into both of those in later sections. For now, the important thing is that tools give us reach into places where bones don't preserve well, which turns out to be most places on Earth. Ancient environments add another layer. By analyzing pollen, sediment chemistry, animal bones, and isotopes locked inside fossil teeth, scientists can reconstruct the landscapes Homo erectus was moving through at different points in time. What they find is a species that was not confined to one type of habitat. Savannas, yes, but also forest edges, river valleys, lake margins, and eventually the more seasonal and variable environments of Georgia, China, and Southeast Asia. This ecological flexibility is one of the things that sets Homo erectus apart from earlier human relatives, who seem to have been much more tightly tied to specific environments and specific food sources. Which brings us to what survival actually means in this context. Not just staying alive individually, not just leaving descendants. Survival here means something larger. Persistence across time, spread across space and flexibility in the face of a world that never stopped changing. Homo erectus was not dominant in the way a large predator is dominant. They were not armoured, not especially fast, not physically overwhelming. They survived the way generalists survive, by being useful in multiple contexts, by adapting incrementally, by spreading their presence widely enough that no single catastrophe could eliminate them everywhere at once. That's the pattern we're going to keep returning to tonight. Not a single spectacular adaptation, but a constellation of them, layered across time and geography, accumulating slowly into something that worked for longer than almost anything else in our evolutionary line. And the place to start understanding how they pulled it off is in the body itself, the anatomy that made the long walk possible in the first place. If you could stand beside an adult Homo erectus on an open plain, the first impression might be unsettlingly familiar. From the neck down, they would not look like the hunched, half-ape caricatures that still show up in outdated illustrations. They would look human, different in the details, but recognizably part of our body plan. The leg bones tell the story most clearly. Compared to earlier hominins, the limbs of Homo erectus are long, especially from hip to ankle. The ratio of arm length to leg length is strikingly close to that of modern humans. No elongated, chimp-like forearms built for climbing, no short, compromised limbs suited to both trees and ground, but perfect for neither. This was a body that had committed to the ground, a walker through and through. The pelvis and spine back that up. The hips of Homo erectus are broad enough to support upright posture, the sacrum angled in a way that stabilizes the trunk over the legs. The vertebrae show the familiar S-shaped curvature that helps distribute weight and absorb shock during bipedal walking. The feet, as far as we can tell from preserved bones and footprints from related early Homo, had strong arches and aligned big toes. This is the architecture of efficient bipedal travel, not the awkward shuffling you get when an ape simply stands on two legs. Efficiency is the key word here. Walking on two legs is not just a party trick. Done right, it's one of the most energy-efficient ways to move a medium-sized mammal across long distances. Humans today are remarkably good at it. When you measure oxygen consumption, we can walk farther per calorie than many quadrupeds of similar size. The evidence suggests Homo erectus was already tapping into this same economy of motion. One of the most important clues comes from that nearly complete skeleton from Kenya, often called Turkana boy. His long legs, narrow hips, and relatively slender build suggest a creature adapted not to short bursts of power, but to sustained locomotion. The length of his lower limbs relative to his torso would have given him a long stride for his height. Each step covered more ground, each mile cost fewer calories. Over days and weeks and months, those savings add up. Some researchers argue that Homo erectus went beyond just walking efficiently. They suggest this species was also one of the first true endurance runners. This idea, known as the endurance running hypothesis, is still under active debate, but it's worth exploring because it ties together a suite of anatomical details that otherwise look a bit puzzling. Distance running, the kind where you cover many kilometers at a steady pace rather than sprinting flat out, puts stress on very specific parts of the body. You need a head that doesn't loll wildly with every footfall, a trunk that stays stable, limbs that can dissipate impact forces, and joints tuned for repetitive motion rather than explosive leaps. When anatomists look at Homo erectus, they see hints of all of these. The neutral region at the back of the skull, where neck muscles attach, appears more developed than in earlier hominins. That suggests stronger muscles to hold the head steady, useful if you're trotting for hours under a hot sun. Some Homo erectus fossils show evidence of well-developed gluteal muscle attachments, the buttocks that modern runners rely on to stabilize the pelvis with every step. The long Achilles tendon and spring-like foot arches seen in later Homo, and likely present in something similar form in Erectus, act like elastic bands, storing and releasing energy with each stride. At the same time, there are caveats. The fossil record is patchy. Not all Homo erectus individuals had the same body proportions. Some were more robust, some more gracile, some adapted to cooler or more forested environments where distance running would have been less central. So, while it's plausible that at least some populations of Homo erectus were capable endurance runners, it's safer to say they were highly capable endurance walkers who could probably run for significant distances when needed. The details vary by region and time, but the underlying theme of stamina keeps showing up. Stamina is not just about muscles and bones, it's also about heat. Moving for long periods under a tropical or subtropical sun generates a lot of internal warmth. If you can't get rid of that heat, your brain and organs start to fail. This is where another suite of Homo erectus adaptations comes into play: thermoregulation. Compared to more heavily furred mammals, humans are naked apes. We have relatively little body hair and an extraordinary density of sweat glands. Evaporative cooling through sweat allows us to shed heat far more effectively than most animals, especially in hot, dry conditions. The origins of this sweating system are complex, and we don't have direct fossilized sweat glands from Homo erectus. But the overall body form points strongly in that direction. The long limbs and relatively narrow, elongated torso of many Homo erectus individuals create a high surface area to volume ratio. More surface area means more room to radiate heat away. A tall, slim body under an open sky presents less cross-section to the noonday sun when you're upright than a quadruped does, and more of that surface is vertical and exposed to moving air. Stand on two legs, and the part of your body directly facing the sun shrinks dramatically compared to being on all fours. Add sweating to that mix, and you get a system that can keep functioning at times and in places where heavily furred predators have to retreat to the shade. Large cats need to pant to cool down and risk overheating if they chase prey for too long during the heat of the day. A Homo erectus with a well-developed sweating system, lightly clad in sparse hair, could keep plodding along, step after step after step. This combination of endurance and heat tolerance leads to a striking possibility. Homo erectus may have been able to outlast their prey, not by outrunning them in short sprints, but by simply never stopping. The idea of persistence hunting, tracking an animal in the heat until it collapses from exhaustion, has been documented among some modern forager groups. Whether Homo erectus practiced it regularly is still debated, and the direct evidence is thin. But their bodies would at least have made that strategy possible, especially in open, hot environments where shade was scarce and water sources were scattered. Even without full-blown persistence hunting, the advantages of mobility in a changing world are obvious. A body built for distance means you can range widely in search of scattered food patches, seasonal waterholes, and migrating herds. When a local river dries up or a stand of fruiting trees fails, you're not trapped. You can walk to the next valley, and the one beyond that, and the one beyond that, carrying your tools and knowledge with you. Over thousands of years, this capacity to move doesn't just save individuals, it reshapes population survival. Groups that can relocate when conditions sour are less likely to be wiped out by local droughts or ecosystem collapses. They can follow grazers as grasslands shift, skirt around regions hit by volcanic eruptions, and gradually explore new habitats at the edges of their familiar range. Efficient travel turns geography from a prison into a set of options. There's a trade-off hidden in all of this. Long-distance walking and running bodies tend to be relatively lightly built compared to the massive, power-focused frames of some earlier hominins. Homo erectus skeletons are still more robust than ours in many ways, with thick cranial bones and strong limbs, but they are not specialized bruisers. Natural selection was shaping a compromise, a body strong enough to cope with rough terrain and physical tasks, but tuned above all for endurance and versatility rather than sheer force. And that compromise wasn't uniform across 2 million years or across continents. Early African Homo erectus, sometimes called Homo ergaster, may have been generally taller and more linear, ideal for hot savannas. Later Javanese populations look more robust in the skull and possibly in the body, perhaps reflecting different climates, different diets, different selective pressures. Populations in temperate East Asia faced cold winters, and may have worn more body fat or different proportions than their equatorial cousins. Homo erectus was not a single, unchanging template. It was a theme endlessly remixed by environment and time. Still, through all those variations, the core pattern holds. This was a hominin that leaned into the advantages of bipedalism, turning a somewhat awkward ape innovation into a refined, efficient way of life. Long legs, stable hips, a cooling system that could keep the engine running, and a willingness to keep moving when other animals had to stop. Once you have that, a new set of possibilities opens up. You can spend more time ranging for food. You can afford to carry tools and perhaps provisions. You can connect with neighbouring groups that live a day's walk away, and then 2 days, and then 3. Mobility becomes not just a way to survive, but a way to weave a wider social and ecological network. And that, in turn, changes how childhood works, how learning happens, and how knowledge moves from one generation to the next. Because a body that can walk all day is only part of the story. The other part sits inside the skull, the growing, flexible brain that would make all that movement meaningful. If you could see inside that skull, the first thing you'd probably notice is that it wasn't small. Compared to the apes, and compared to the earlier hominins who first started walking upright, Homo erectus had a significantly larger brain. Not a modern human brain, not yet, but no longer the compact chimp-sized organ of their more distant ancestors. Across the 2 million year span of Homo erectus fossils, brain volume tends to fall in a broad band, from roughly 600 cubic centimetres in the earliest, smallest individuals up to 1,000, or a bit more in later ones. For comparison, chimpanzees average around 400. Modern humans cluster around 1,300 to 1,400. So Erectus was right in the middle, neither ape nor us, occupying its own plateau. It's tempting to see this as a rung on a ladder. Small brain, medium brain, big brain. Progress. But evolution doesn't work like a staircase. It's more like a landscape, with many paths and plateaus, many local peaks that are big enough for the problems at hand. For Homo erectus, that middle-sized brain seems to have been enough. Enough to coordinate long-distance travel, navigate complex landscapes, track the movements of herds and seasons. Enough to remember where waterholes were, when certain trees fruited, how to find raw stone and transform it into a useful edge. Bigger isn't automatically better. Brains are expensive. They demand calories, constant oxygen, elaborate cooling. Any extra tissue that doesn't help you survive is a liability, not a luxury. So when we see a jump in brain size, and then a long period where it holds roughly steady, it suggests a trade-off that found its balance. Homo erectus seems to have settled into a cognitive sweet spot for a very long time. Large enough to plan, to learn, to share routines. Not so large that it pushed the body into constant crisis just to feed it. What matters is not only how big that brain was, but what it could do. One of the quiet revolutions inside that skull was in the realm of attention and planning. Earlier hominins who flaked a stone might have done so in a more ad hoc way. Hit rock until you get a sharp piece. Use it, discard it. With Homo erectus, the archaeological record starts to show routines. To take a chunk of stone and turn it into a standardized tool, you need to hold multiple steps in mind. You need to see the blank as something that could become something else. Several strikes from now, you need to pay attention not just to what's in your hand, but to the shape you're steering toward. That kind of mental time travel, the ability to project actions into the near future, to anticipate the result of a sequence, is one of the hallmarks of more complex cognition. It doesn't require language as we know it. It doesn't require art or myth. It just requires a brain that can stay with a task longer, index each step, and adjust as the stone responds. Over and over, in sites spread across Africa, Asia, and eventually Europe, we find artifacts that suggest Homo erectus brains were doing exactly this. The tools are not all the same, and they change through time, but they show patterns of repetition that are hard to produce without some form of internal script. That script didn't live only in individual heads, it moved between them. And this is where childhood comes in. A big brain is difficult to grow. It won't fit through the birth canal fully formed. So much of its development has to happen after birth, exposed to the world, buffered by caregivers. Even in Homo erectus, whose pelvis was narrower and whose infants probably had smaller brains at birth than ours, the pattern of prolonged growth seems to have already begun. We can't watch a Homo erectus childhood directly, but we get clues. Tooth development, for instance, tends to correlate with growth rate. In apes, teeth come in relatively fast. Life history is compressed. In modern humans, the schedule is drawn out. The fossil teeth we have from Homo erectus seem to fall between those poles. Not as slow as us, but likely slower than a chimp. A slower childhood means more time in a vulnerable state. That's risky, but it also means more time to learn. Imagine a young Homo erectus walking with adults on a long day's journey. They're not strong enough yet to carry much, not experienced enough to lead the way, but they're watching. They see which rocks an elder stops to test, which ones get hefted twice and then tucked into a sling which are ignored. They see how the group fans out when they approach a patch of woodland, how someone circles downwind when there's a hint of animal scent. None of this requires a formal lesson. It just requires time. Time for repetition, for pattern recognition, for making the association between what the adults do and what happens next. Social learning is like a multiplier for survival. A solitary learner has to reinvent techniques by trial and error, starting from scratch each generation. A social learner inherits a baseline of tricks, shortcuts and cautions, and then maybe adds a few more. The Homo erectus fossil record with its widespread long-lasting tool traditions is hard to explain without some degree of this multiplier at work. An extended juvenile phase also encourages more complex social structure. If you have children who depend on adults for longer, you need more reliable cooperation between individuals. You need parents who tolerate noisy, curious youngsters, and perhaps other group members who help feed and protect them. Those relationships, in turn, create opportunities for transmitting more than just how to crack a bone or where to find flint. They allow for the passing on of norms, what is shared, what is hoarded, when to move on, who has authority in a group. Some anthropologists think that by the time of Homo erectus, the basic outlines of a slow life history, delayed maturity, longer lifespan, prolonged learning were already emerging. Not as extreme as ours, but moving in that direction. If that's true, then childhood was not a mere cost. It was an investment strategy. Where there's long learning, communication becomes more important. We have to be careful here. There is no recording of a Homo erectus conversation, no fossilized sentence. Their throats and tongues don't preserve cleanly, and the brain regions we associate with language in modern humans can't be mapped neatly onto ancient endocasts. Still, we can say some things about possibility. The shape of the spinal canal in Homo erectus suggests that they already had reasonably fine control over breathing, one of the preconditions for producing varied vocal sounds. The complexity of their foraging strategies, their tool traditions, and their likely social structures would all have been easier with some ability to label things, call individuals, coordinate actions with more than just gestures and grunts. Many researchers propose that Erectus had something like proto-language, not the full, rapidly recursive, grammatically rich speech of later Homo sapiens, but a structured set of vocal signals that went beyond what other apes manage. Perhaps simple word-like calls for common things: water, fire, here, there, danger. Perhaps more elaborate rhythmic patterns used to hold attention, soothe infants, mark the beginning or end of group activities. Whatever form it took, any improvement in the ability to point attention in the same direction, to transmit there's a carcass over that ridge, but watch for lions would have been strongly favoured by natural selection. Individuals and groups that could communicate a bit more clearly would waste less energy, avoid more dangers, and coordinate their movements across the landscape more effectively. And that landscape was wide. Over its long history, Homo erectus lived in environments that ranged from hot African savannas to river valleys in temperate Asia, from coastal plains to forest margins. Each setting posed different problems, heat or cold stress, different plants and animals to know, different patterns of rain and drought. A species that relies mostly on fixed instincts struggles when moved to a new environment. A species with a large, flexible brain and a culture of social learning can adjust. You don't need to rewrite the genes for every new valley. You can rewrite the behavior. When a group of Homo erectus encountered a new type of nut that required a different kind of cracking, they didn't have to wait for natural selection to sculpt a new tooth shape. They could experiment with different rocks, different angles, and then show successful tricks to each other. When prey animals behave differently in forest edge compared to open grassland, they could modify their tracking routines and pass those refinements down the chain of apprentices. In this way, learning became a second layer of adaptation, sitting on top of the slower genetic layer. It allowed Homo erectus to maintain a coherent body plan and brain architecture, while still fitting into very different habitats across Africa and Eurasia. 2 million years is an extraordinary run for any large-bodied mammal, especially one as specialized in some ways as Homo erectus. Their success was not just a matter of muscle, bone, and sweat. It rested just as much on this quieter power, a brain big enough to plan and to remember, a childhood long enough to absorb what others had discovered, a web of communication strong enough to bind individuals into teaching and learning communities. With that combination, each new place was not an entirely new challenge. It was another lesson to be learned, another pattern to be noticed, another story to be added to the shared memory of the group. And over time, that habit of learning, of making, of refining, of passing on, would begin to reshape the very tools they carried in their hands. Before the famous Handaxes arrive on the scene, before the beautiful teardrop shapes you see in museum cases, there is something quieter in the record, rougher, easier to overlook, a chunk of stone with a few flakes knocked off, a thin shard with one sharp edge, a battered core that looks, at first glance, like rubble. This is the Oldowan tradition, named after sites in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, but spread far beyond it, and it forms the deep background for Homo erectus. In its simplest form, Oldowan technology is almost brutally straightforward. You take a hard stone, the hammer, you strike another stone, the core. If you angle the blow just right, a flake pops off with a razor edge. You can use the flake as a knife. You can keep hitting the core to knock off more flakes. Eventually, the core itself might have an edge you can scrape with. Earlier hominins were already doing this before Homo erectus appears. But with erectus, this core and flake logic becomes a habit, a constant presence wherever they go. On its own, a sharp flake doesn't look like much of a revolution. But think about what it lets you do to the world around you. The moment you have a stone edge, the boundary of what your teeth and nails can handle changes. You can open things. A recently dead antelope on the savannah is not just a lump of tough hide and bone anymore. With teeth alone you'd be limited to soft parts, and only if you can tear through the skin before someone larger drives you away. With a flake, that hide becomes a problem you can solve. A few quick cuts at the joints free up the limbs. A slit down the belly opens the abdominal cavity. You can slice meat into strips small enough to swallow easily. You can reach tendons, fat, organs, all the dense, calorie-rich tissues that would otherwise be difficult to access in a hurry. You can also dig into bone for a carnivore. the story doesn't end with meat. Some of the richest nutrients are locked away inside the skeleton, in the marrow. To a jaw with modest bite force and flattish teeth, a large limb bone is a fortress. To a hominin with a rock and a plan, it's a vault with a brittle lock. Archaeological sites from the time of Homo erectus, and a bit earlier, show bones with fracture patterns that match deliberate hammering. Long bones smashed at their midpoints, spiral fractures produced by force applied to fresh, still greasy bone. Inside those bones 2 million years ago was a soft, fatty paste loaded with calories and micronutrients. Marrow is especially valuable in lean times, when the dry season stretches on, when plant foods are scarce and large kills are rare, scavenged carcasses and their bones can keep a group going. Even when predators have stripped away most of the meat, the marrow remains, waiting for any creature clever enough to break in. Stone tools also turn skin and sinew into resources, not waste. With a scraper, basically a flake with a retouched dulled back edge to hold and a sharp front edge to work with, you can process hides. Scraping away connective tissue and fat makes them easier to dry. Dried hides can be used as simple wraps, windbreaks, perhaps even crude slings for carrying things. Sinew can be pulled, twisted, used to tie or bind. We don't see those hides or bindings in the fossil record. They rot away. But the cut marks on bones and the wear patterns on stone edges suggest this broader world of use. When you put all of this together, something important emerges. Stone tools widen the menu. A hominin without tools is constrained to foods that can be bitten, torn, or cracked with its own anatomy, or to whatever soft things it can find. A hominin with a toolkit can treat a carcass as a multi-part puzzle, can peel bark, cut roots, open tough-shelled fruits, process fibrous plants, and dig out buried tubers with the aid of sticks, whose ends have been sharpened with stone. Diet breadth matters enormously for survival over long timescales. Ecosystems shift. Rain comes later, or not at all. Herds migrate differently. A species that depends on one or two narrow food types is always a bad season away from catastrophe. A species that can tap multiple layers of the food web, seeds, roots, insects, meat, marrow, brains, even bone grease, can ride out more variability. Stone tools, especially within the Oldowan tradition, don't just increase efficiency when times are good. They act as a buffer when times are bad. But our window into this world is very skewed. What survives in the ground for 1 million, 2 million years? Hard things, stone, sometimes bone, maybe a few teeth. If Homo erectus and their predecessors used wooden digging sticks to pry out roots, we don't see most of those. If they carried loads in woven grass slings or bark strips, those have disappeared. If they used sharpened stakes to probe termite mounds or to startle small animals from burrows, only in very rare cases would we find a trace. There are hints. At a few waterlogged or exceptionally preserved sites from later periods, we see ancient wooden spears and digging sticks associated with other hominins. Simple physics suggests that if a group is already skilled at planning strikes on stone and reading fracture lines, they can also learn to whittle, smooth, and point wood. So, when we look at an Oldowan scatter, cores, flakes, battered cobbles, we are probably seeing just the stone backbone of a richer, mostly invisible toolkit. The hard frame around a soft, vanished cloud of perishable tools. Even within stone there are limits to what we can infer. A flake that looks like waste to us might have been a prized cutting edge to them. A core that seems finished in a lab might have been picked up again and reused weeks later. Stone doesn't record ownership, skill level, or the stories that attach to particular pieces. What it does show, increasingly clearly with Homo erectus, is pattern. Cores are not being hit at random. Knappers are choosing particular raw materials, fine-grained basalt, quartzite, flint. They're striking at particular angles, turning the core in their hands to exploit its geometry. They're doing this again and again, across different sites, across long stretches of time. To make Oldowan tools at that level of consistency, you don't just need hands. You need minds that can recognize success and failure, can standardize movements, can copy each other. This is where the habit of making becomes social. Imagine a small group of Homo Erectus at a riverside camp. An older individual squats with a cobble in their lap, a hammerstone in one hand. A curious youngster edges closer. Every time the hammer moves, flakes jump away with a satisfying sound. Pieces are sorted into little piles, some kept, some pushed aside. The child doesn't have to be told what's happening in a modern human way. They just have to see that after this rhythmic, focused activity, the group has new sharp things, and that those sharp things are used on food. Over weeks and months they try it themselves. Their first attempts are clumsy. Flakes break in weird directions. Edges crumble. But they watch, mimic, adjust. Teaching, at this stage in human evolution, probably looked less like explicit instruction and more like structured opportunity. Adults tolerate children underfoot while working. They slow down key actions. They repeat sequences. They hand over partly worked cores that are easier to finish. They maybe make simple vocal sounds or gestures associated with particular steps. Imitation does the rest. Once a behavior like this becomes embedded in a group, once we make tools like this is part of how the group operates, it does more than fill bellies. It stabilizes identity. Groups that share tool-making habits also share movement patterns, foraging strategies, ideas about who does what and when. A place with good raw stone becomes a meeting point. Knowledge of where those places are and how to work the stone found there becomes part of the group's mental map. Over time, those mental maps and motor routines are passed along just as surely as genes are. A child inherits more than eye colour and limb length. They inherit a way of turning rocks into edges and carcasses into meals. They inherit a sense of how we do things. This is culture in a very early, very practical form. When archaeologists find Oldowan-like tools spread across regions where Homo erectus lived, for hundreds of thousands of years, they are looking at the fossilized trace of that cultural habit. Not in the sense of paintings and stories, but in the sense of reliable shared techniques carried by bodies moving through space and time. The Oldowan tradition in that light isn't just a pile of broken rocks. It's the training ground in which Homo erectus brains and hands learn to work together. It's the baseline rhythm of striking and shaping that later slowly evolves into something more elaborate. And that next step, the rise of the carefully shaped, unmistakably intentional Handaxe, is where the tool revolution really starts to show its full force. The first time someone picked up a stone and decided not just to knock off flakes, but to shape the whole thing into a deliberate form, a different way of thinking entered the world. Archaeologists call the result an Acheulean Handaxe, named after a site in France where they were first recognized in the 19th century. But the story they tell is much older and much broader than any one valley in Europe. These tools begin to appear about 1.7 million years ago in East Africa, not long after Homo erectus itself emerges. Over time, they spread with erectus and related hominins into North Africa, the Middle East, parts of Europe, and across much of southern Asia. In some regions they persist with local variation for more than 1 million years. If Oldowan tools are like the pocket knife blades of prehistory, simple, sharp, disposable Acheulean Handaxes are more like the first serious multi-tools. Picture a roughly oval or teardrop-shaped stone, sometimes the size of your palm, sometimes as long as your forearm. Both faces have been carefully flaked, thinning the edges and creating a continuous, symmetrical outline. One end tends to be more pointed, the other a bit rounded, fitting snugly in the hand. Functionally, it's a Swiss Army knife made of rock. That long, sharp edge can slice through animal hide and flesh during butchery. The pointed tip can be used to puncture, to pry into joints, to dig. The broader, thicker base can absorb pounding, acting like a light-duty hammer. With a bit of skill, you can use the same tool to dismember a carcass, scrape a hide, chop branches, and process tough plant foods. Use wear analyses, tiny scratches, polish, and micro-damage on ancient edges suggest exactly this kind of multi-purpose life. Some hand axes show traces consistent with cutting meat. Others have polish that fits repeated contact with wood or fibrous plants. A single tool might move from task to task over weeks of use, resharpened at the edges as needed. From a survival standpoint, that flexibility is gold. If you're Homo Erectus moving through a landscape where you can't carry much, a robust all-purpose implement makes more sense than a sack full of specialized gadgets. One stone well made can keep paying off in different ways as circumstances change. You come across a carcass, it's your knife. You need a digging stick, it's your sharpener. You want to peel bark, open nuts, slice roots, it's your cutter and scraper. But the hand axe is not just about practicality, it's about pattern. When archaeologists lay out Acheulean tools from different sites and time periods, a strange thing happens. Despite all the local variation, different stone types, different sizes, different degrees of refinement, there's a recognizable family resemblance. Over hundreds of thousands of years, across thousands of kilometers, you keep seeing this same basic form, bifacial, elongated, with a carefully arranged edge. At some sites, the symmetry is so precise that modern flint knappers struggle to match it. Individual makers clearly cared about getting the shape right, even when a rougher object would probably have cut just as well. This has led to a long-running debate. What exactly were these things for, and why did they show such consistency? One view puts function front and center. In this picture, the Acheulean handaxe is a generalized butchery and processing tool. Standardization happens not because people are obsessed with aesthetics, but because certain shapes simply work best. If you want a comfortable grip and a long, controllable cutting edge, you end up converging on a similar silhouette, just as different cultures today independently reinvent similar knife forms. Another view suggests that by the time you're trimming edges to find symmetry, you're doing something beyond pure utility. A thick, lopsided handaxe can still chop up meat, but in many assemblages we see tools that have been refined far beyond that point, their edges straightened, their proportions balanced. Some are too big or too delicate for everyday chores and show little sign of use. These might have served as social signals as much as tools, evidence of skill, patience, and tradition. In that reading, the Acheulean handaxe isn't just a multi-purpose implement. It's a badge of belonging, a way of saying, I learnt how we do things from my people, and I can do it well. Skill matters here. To turn a raw cobble into a thin, symmetrical handaxe, you need to understand how force travels through stone. You have to plan several steps ahead, removing big flakes early without shattering the piece, then progressively refining the outline. Mistakes can't always be fixed. A bad blow can ruin hours of work. The learning curve for this kind of knapping is steep. Modern experiments suggest it may take years of practice to reach high levels of proficiency. That implies sustained teaching, observation, and feedback within a group. Elders passing on motor routines, youngsters imitating, everyone recognizing what counts as a good result. This is where the idea of a shared tradition becomes powerful. When you find similar Acheulean handaxes scattered across a landscape, you're not just seeing isolated individuals reinventing the wheel. You're likely seeing communities linked by some combination of direct contact, shared ancestry, and parallel teaching methods. A way of doing things that persists not because of genes alone, but because of cultural copying. Skill in this sense becomes a kind of inheritance alongside DNA. A child of Homo erectus doesn't just inherit hand strength and brain size. They inherit a social environment in which certain stone shapes are familiar, admired, perhaps even expected. They grow up surrounded by the sound of flint being struck, by the sight of adults evaluating cores and edges. When it's their turn, they don't start from zero. They start from a template. Across generations, this template gives Acheulean technologies a kind of coherence, a recognizable accent in stone. It's one of the earliest, clearest examples of what anthropologists mean by a technocomplex, a broad, long-lived toolkit that signals shared habits and mental models, even as individual pieces vary. But the story is not one of uniformity everywhere. For one thing, Acheulean handaxes do not blanket the entire range of Homo erectus. In parts of East Asia, especially beyond a rough line, sometimes called the movius line, classic handaxes are rare or absent in many sites from periods when they are common elsewhere. Instead, we see simpler core and flake industries that look more like Oldowan traditions, sometimes alongside very expedient, minimally shaped tools. Why? There are several possibilities, and they're not mutually exclusive. One explanation points to raw materials. In some regions, the available stone may have been poor for making large, thin bifaces. If your landscape mostly offers pebbles that fracture unpredictably or crumble under stress, investing in refined symmetry makes less sense. Quick flakes from whatever rock you have at hand might be the more efficient choice. Another explanation leans into ecology and lifestyle. If local groups relied heavily on resources that didn't require large cutting tools, say more plant foods, small game, shellfish, or opportunistic scavenging of smaller carcasses, then the big handaxe niche might simply not have existed. In dense forests, for instance, the visibility and movement patterns that favour certain hunting strategies are different from those on open savannas. Yet another angle is cultural. It's possible that different Homo erectus populations developed distinct traditions, some of which emphasized bifacial tools and others that doubled down on simpler flake technologies combined with perishable implements in wood, bone, or bamboo. In that case, the absence of handaxes in some regions would not signal inferiority, but divergence. Modern foraging peoples show how this can work. Neighbouring groups with similar environments sometimes use very different toolkits, not because one is better, but because each tradition has its own history and logic. A particular way of doing things can become stable, simply because everyone knows it and teaches it, even if alternative solutions are possible. When we look at the Acheulean through that lens, the picture shifts. Instead of imagining a single linear march from simple to advanced tools, we see branching paths. In some populations, the handaxe tradition becomes a central pillar, a visible, tangible marker of identity and expertise. In others, the same basic brains and bodies channel their problem-solving into different material strategies, many of which vanish from the record because they were made of wood or plant fibres. What unites these groups is not the specific shape of their tools, but the underlying habit, the expectation that tools will be made, improved, and taught. The idea that there is a right way to strike, a right way to hold, a right way to make a useful edge. Acheulean handaxes make that expectation visible at a grand scale. They are the stone shadows of an invisible network of shared skills, stretching across continents and deep time. For Homo erectus, carrying that network in their heads and hands may have been as important as any single innovation. A group with a strong tradition can move into new territories and still recognize themselves in their work. They can meet neighboring bands and see, in the curve of a tool, echoes of their own history, or notice the differences that mark another lineage. Over more than 1 million years, as climates shifted and ranges expanded, these shared tool traditions helped stabilize memory. They provided a common language of making that could survive droughts, migrations, and local extinctions. In that sense, each handaxe lying buried in the ground is more than an artifact. It's a fossilized sentence in a story about how knowledge survives without writing. And with that durable culture in place, Homo erectus was ready to push its food strategies even further, not just reacting to opportunities, but actively shaping them, from scavenging scraps to orchestrating hunts and exploiting whatever the landscape could offer. If Acheulean Handaxes were the sentences in Homo erectus' story, food was the plot. Tools only matter if they change what you can eat, when you can eat it, and how reliably you can keep doing that from season to season. Over nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus didn't just get better at finding food. They reworked the whole relationship between bodies, tools, and landscapes to see how it helps to imagine a spectrum rather than a single lifestyle. On one end is simple scavenging. You're not chasing down big animals, you're looking for what's already dead. A lion kills a zebra, eats its fill, and moves off. Vultures gather, hyenas circle. Eventually, there's a window of time when a half-stripped carcass lies on the ground, still rich in meat and marrow, but no longer guarded by a full pride of hungry predators. If you're a small-bodied ape with modest tools and weak weapons, that window isn't very useful. You arrive late, pick at scraps, and hope you don't get bitten. If you're Homo erectus with sharp flakes and heavy hand axes, the equation shifts. Now you can slice through hide quickly. You can break open long bones to reach the fat-rich marrow. You can cut tendons and disarticulate joints before your fingers go numb or a hyena pack shows up. You don't need to own the whole carcass. You just need a brief, safe interval and the skill to harvest the best bits fast. This is classic scavenging, but done with a technological assist. Further along the spectrum is what researchers call confrontational scavenging. Here, you're not waiting until the predators have finished. You're pushing the timing earlier, closer to danger. A big cat is still on the kill, or only just dragged it down. Maybe there are cubs nearby. Maybe the hyenas haven't fully committed yet. In this scenario, Homo erectus bands may have approached in groups, relying on numbers, noise, and thrown stones or sticks to harass the original killers, testing their nerve. A single individual couldn't do this safely. 10 or 15, coordinated and emboldened by experience, might. You can imagine a tense, noisy standoff at the edge of a kill site. Predators snarling and reluctant to yield. Hominins shouting, brandishing burning branches when they learn to use fire, hurling rocks, inching forward when the big cats flinch back. A precarious contest of risk and reward. If they win, they get access not just to scraps, but to a relatively fresh carcass with muscle meat and organs intact. If they lose, someone may be mauled or killed. This is not a minor tweak in behaviour. It's a different way of inhabiting the food web. Instead of being quiet gleaners at the bottom of the scavenger hierarchy, Homo erectus starts muzzling its way up, leveraging cooperation, courage, and tools to claim a share of high-value resources. At the far end of the spectrum lies hunting. Now the animal is alive when you commit. You're not waiting for other predators to make the first move. You are the predator. What that looked like for Homo erectus is still debated. They probably weren't sprinting after gazelles like cheetahs or ambushing bison from trees like leopards. Their strength lay in endurance and planning. One idea, often discussed, is persistence hunting. In this strategy, a small group tracks a medium-sized animal in the heat of the day, following it steadily over many kilometers. The prey runs in panic, overheats, stops to pant, then runs again. Humans with our efficient cooling systems and long-distance gait can keep walking or trotting, closing the gap each time the animal falters. Eventually, the exhausted prey can no longer flee. Then come the stones, the spears, the close approach. Did Homo erectus routinely hunt this way? The fossil record can't give a simple yes or no, but their anatomy, long legs, springy tendons, barrel-shaped chest, sweating skin, is consistent with a body built for sustained locomotion. Combined with even simple throwing weapons and group coordination, they would have been capable of turning that endurance into predation under the right conditions. Hunting doesn't have to mean taking down huge animals either. Smaller game, antelopes, pigs, deer, even large birds and reptiles would have been within reach, especially if groups learned to drive them into ambushes, boggy ground, or natural traps. Across this whole spectrum, from late arrival at someone else's kill to full-on predation, one thing stays constant. Meat and fat are central prizes. In seasonal environments where plant foods come and go with rains and temperature swings, animal tissue offers something rare, concentrated calories that can be stored in the body and shared within the group. Muscle meat provides protein and some fat. Organs deliver vitamins and minerals not easily obtained from roots and leaves. Marrow and brain tissue pack dense, energy-rich fat that can keep a lean body going through lean weeks. For a species with a growing brain, an organ that burns a disproportionate amount of energy, this matters. A more regular supply of meat and fat doesn't mean feast every day. It means that over the arc of months and years, caloric intake can be smoothed out. Bad seasons become survivable if you can fall back on dried meat, stored marrow in bone caches, or repeated access to scavenged carcasses. Adult bodies can handle shortfalls, growing children cannot. Any strategy that stabilizes calories for youngsters has a powerful effect on survival and, over evolutionary time, on brain development and social complexity. But meat is not just energy, it is also negotiation. A carcass, whether scavenged or hunted, rarely belongs to a single individual in species like ours. It lands in the middle of social life. Imagine a group of Homo erectus clustered around a fresh kill. Some individuals did more of the dangerous work. Others helped track or guarded children, or carried water and tools. Now the question is, who gets what? The choicest parts, organ meats, fatty ribs, marrow bones, are limited. Sharing them can cement alliances. Withholding them can punish defectors. Elder relatives, skilled hunters, nursing mothers, and vulnerable youngsters may each have implicit claims. Arguments can flare, so can generosity, around a carcass. Cooperation and conflict are braided together. Predators add another layer of risk. Open butchery sites are magnet signals for lions, hyenas, and other scavengers. The longer you stick around, the more likely something big and toothy will show up. So you need ways to process quickly or to defend your space. Archaeologists see hints of this in the bones themselves. Some animal assemblages show clear patterns of cut marks, long, fine incisions where stone edges sliced flesh away from bone, overlapping or even lying beneath tooth marks from carnivores. In some cases, hominins seem to have arrived first, stripped meat, and then lost the leftovers to predators. In others, tooth marks come first, with hominin cut marks added later, suggesting late-stage scavenging of what predators left behind. There are campsites where the majority of bones bear both kinds of damage, telling a story of mixed strategies, sometimes hunting, sometimes scavenging, always competing. Interpreting these traces is tricky. At some sites, researchers argue that the age ranges and body parts of animals suggest deliberate hunting of particular species. For instance, many individuals in their prime with a pattern of limb bones that looks more like human transport than random death. Others counter that the same data could come from selective scavenging of carcasses killed by big cats who prefer certain body parts and leave others. Some sites seem organized with clusters of tools and bones, suggesting central places where carcasses were brought, processed, and shared. Others look more like short, opportunistic stops. A few bones, a few flakes, then gone. Debates can get surprisingly heated over the direction of a cut or the exact angle of a tooth groove. Did Homo erectus get there first? Did they finish the job? Were they mainly hunters with some scavenging on the side, or mainly scavengers who occasionally managed to kill? The most reasonable picture, given all this, is one of flexibility rather than purity. Homo erectus was probably not locked into a single food strategy any more than modern foragers are. In some regions and seasons, hunting might have dominated repeated pursuit of certain herd animals across open savannas, with well-practiced butchery routines and shared expectations about who gets which cuts. In others, scavenging, especially confrontational scavenging, may have been the safest and most efficient option, particularly where large carnivores were abundant and kill sites predictable. Near coasts and rivers, fish, shellfish, and aquatic plants might have joined the diet. In forests, plant foods, small animals, and occasional larger game would have formed a different mix. In each case, Homo erectus could plug into the local ecology, adjusting how much time and risk they invested in hunting versus watching, following, and stealing. Opportunism in this sense is not a lack of sophistication. It's a strategy, a species that can survive 2 million years through ice ages, drought cycles, and shifting landscapes, probably doesn't specialize itself into a corner. Instead, it maintains a wide behavioral toolkit and a willingness to pivot. If there's a carcass and no lions, you become a butcher. If there's a herd in sight and your band is strong, you become a hunter. If the big predators are out and the wind is wrong, you fall back on roots, nuts, and whatever small creatures you can safely catch. Over generations, this kind of flexible opportunism is what natural selection tunes. Not a romantic image of pure hunters or mere scavengers, Homo erectus bodies built for distance. Their tools designed for cutting, prying, breaking. Their social lives organized enough to cooperate, negotiate, and remember where food could be found. Put all of that together, and you get a creature whose real superpower was not any one trick, but the ability to move along that spectrum of food strategies as conditions demanded. That habit of shifting gears, of reading the landscape and adjusting tactics, would become one of the most enduring themes in human history. It underpinned not just how Homo erectus ate, but where they could live, how far they could travel, and how they coped when the world's climate began its long, violent swings. And it set the stage for another quiet revolution, the control of an element that would make carcasses safer, plants more digestible, nights more social, and cold seasons less deadly. Fire was coming into the story. Fire is so central to how we live now that it's hard to imagine a world without it. You cook with it, or with its descendants in stoves and microwaves. You heat your house with it, or with devices that are basically tamed, hidden fire. Streetlights, screens, headlights cutting through darkness, all of them are the long technological shadow of what started as a small, flickering blaze in a landscape that, for most animals, meant danger and death. For Homo erectus, learning not just to fear fire, but to use it, would have been nothing less than a quiet revolution. Think about the problems they were already solving. They had bodies good at distance, tools good at cutting, and social systems good enough for coordinated hunting and scavenging. But every carcass came with a microbial time bomb. Every cold night came with a risk of hypothermia. Every darkness was an open invitation for predators whose eyes, noses, and instincts were tuned for hunting at dusk and after. Now imagine an evening where that equation flips. There's a pool of light in the gloom, a smell of smoke that masks other scents, a ring of warmth where bones don't ache as much, and fingers stay nimble. The crackling sound of burning wood carries farther than a single voice announcing, "Something powerful is here. Approach with caution." That's what controlled fire means, an edge in almost every category that matters. Cooked food is softer, easier to chew, and less likely to harbour parasites and dangerous bacteria. Tough roots and fibrous stems that were only marginally edible when raw can turn into usable calories with enough heat and patience. Meat that might have made you sick becomes safer. Bones can be warmed and cracked for marrow more efficiently. Fats can be rendered, dripped, collected. This is the heart of what's sometimes called the cooking hypothesis. The idea is simple. If you can routinely cook, you can extract more energy from the same foods, and you can do it with less wear on teeth and guts. Over evolutionary time, that efficiency could free up resources for a larger brain, allow shorter guts, reduce the time spent chewing, and smooth out the energy demands of life in harsh seasonal environments. If Homo erectus was already leaning on meat, fat, and tough plant foods, then fire doesn't just add flavour. It amplifies an existing strategy. It widens the menu and makes more of that menu truly usable, especially for children and older individuals whose teeth and digestion aren't at their peak. But here's where the story gets complicated. We'd love to be able to say, on this date, at this site, Homo erectus invented campfires, started roasting tubers, and never looked back. Archaeology doesn't work like that. Fire leaves traces, but they're fragile, scattered, and surprisingly hard to interpret over spans of hundreds of thousands of years. So what counts as evidence? There are a few main clues researchers look for. One is burned bones, animal remains with discoloration and cracking patterns that suggest exposure to heat. Another is reddened or hardened sediment, where the ground itself has been altered by sustained heating. Then there are concentrations of ash, charcoal, and burned stone that seem to form discrete patches, sometimes with tools and bones mixed in. Put all of that together in the right configuration, especially if the burning is in layers that repeat over time at the same spot, and you might have a hearth, a place where fire was deliberately made, maintained, and used. For Homo erectus, some sites do seem to show this. At locations like Gesher Benot Ya aqov in modern Israel, dating to around 780,000 years ago, archaeologists have found clusters of burned flint, charred plant remains, and reddened sediments that appear in consistent patterns. At sites in Africa like Wonderwork Cave, deep inside the cave sediments, there are tiny burned bone fragments and ash particles that may represent controlled fire far earlier than that. But May is doing a lot of work here. Fire isn't only made by humans. Natural wildfires can sweep through landscapes, burning vegetation and bones, leaving behind charcoal and ash that later get mixed into sediments by wind, water, and animals. Lightning can ignite trees. Volcanoes can throw sparks and burning debris for kilometers. So the debate isn't over whether fire existed in the environment. Of course it did. The real questions are, when did hominins learn to approach and benefit from natural fires? When did they start keeping fires going deliberately? And finally, when did they become capable of making fire whenever they needed it, rather than just capturing it from the landscape? Strong proof would look like this: repeated, localized burning in contexts that don't match natural wildfire patterns. Deep in caves, for instance, far from direct lightning strikes, combined with evidence that the same spots were used again and again as living areas. Add in burned bones with cut marks, suggesting cooking and a lack of wildfire-type debris elsewhere in the same layers, and your case gets better. Yet, even at some of the best candidate sites, interpretations differ. Some researchers look at the microscopic structure of ash particles and say, these were made in low-temperature, controlled fires, not in forest infernos. Others counter that the deposits could have been washed in later. Sediments shift, burrowing animals churn up layers, and a few scattered burned bones could easily represent random accidents rather than a stable cooking tradition. Because of this, the timeline for Homo erectus and fire is still one of the liveliest arguments in paleoanthropology. At the cautious end, some scholars place habitual, controlled fire use relatively late, maybe around 400,000 to 500,000 years ago, and see earlier hints as ambiguous. Others argue for much earlier control, perhaps as far back as 1 million to 1.5 million years ago, with Homo erectus in Africa and Eurasia already harnessing flames regularly enough to shape their biology and behavior. Between those positions is a murky middle, a long period where hominins might have used fire opportunistically, capturing natural blazes, tending embers and keeping flames smouldering as they moved from place to place, but not yet able to strike a spark on demand. If you imagine that world, the social implications become fascinating. When fire is rare and precious, it needs guardians. Someone has to collect fuel, feed the coals, and watch for embers blowing away on the wind. Someone has to notice when heat is getting too low or when the flames are licking dangerously close to dry grasses. Children might be warned away from the hottest zones while still being drawn inevitably toward the light and warmth at the centre. Even without full control, just the ability to sit safely near fire would reshape daily rhythms. Nights become longer, not because the planet slows down, but because usable waking hours extend beyond sunset. Instead of the group dispersing into sleep as soon as darkness falls, there's time for something else: conversation, grooming, planning, quiet play, and the slow repetition that turns practical knowledge into shared tradition. Around a fire, teaching gets easier. You can demonstrate how to knap a particular kind of stone, how to recognize an edible plant, how to bind a point to a shaft, all without rushing to beat the setting sun. You can tell a younger hunter where the herds tend to cross a valley in the late dry season, or which ravine hides a spring that never quite runs dry. You can rehearse what to do if lions appear at a carcass, or if a child wanders too close to a cliff. Firelight doesn't just illuminate faces, it illuminates memory. For Homo erectus, whose brains were already larger and whose childhoods were likely longer than those of earlier hominins, these extended evenings could intensify the passing on of skills, stories, and social rules. You don't need complex language as we know it for this to matter. Gestures, simple words, mimicry, and shared attention can go a long way when there is time, warmth, and a stable gathering point. There's also the question of safety. Predators tend to avoid open flames. A ring of fire, or even a single smoky blaze, can act as a fuzzy, shifting barrier between the vulnerable sleeping bodies at the centre and the eyes watching from the dark. It's not perfect. Nothing in nature is, but it changes the odds, especially in landscapes where big cats and hyenas are active at night. Combine warmth, safety, extended waking hours, and more efficient food, and you get a multiplier effect. Children can sleep more deeply and shiver less on cold nights. Wounds from hunts or falls may be less likely to turn septic if some form of rudimentary heat treatment or smoke exposure reduces bacterial load. Older adults whose experience is a crucial part of group memory can survive more winters and more lean seasons, adding extra layers of knowledge. And all of this feeds back into social life. If you picture a Homo erectus group without fire, you might see a loose scattering at dusk. Some individuals here, some there, drifting into darkness wherever they happen to be. With fire, there is a centre. People come back to a place. They gather over countless evenings. Those gatherings may have helped knit individuals into tighter, more stable communities. Decisions about where to move next, how to respond to a rival group, when to risk a long hunt could be discussed, even if discussed at first meant a mix of sounds, gestures, and shared looks rather than elaborate speech. In that sense, fire is not only about cooked meat and warm fingers. It's about creating predictable spaces where social bonds can deepen, skills can be taught, and collective plans can form. Whether Homo erectus mastered it early and fully, or gradually and unevenly, the trajectory is the same. As the ability to harness fire improved, so did the capacity to live in colder regions, to cope with sudden climate dips, to occupy caves and higher latitudes that would have been brutally uncomfortable without artificial heat and light. Fire, in this way, becomes a portable slice of the tropics, a little bubble of warmth that can be carried into new, harsher worlds. And that, in turn, helps explain one of the most remarkable things about Homo erectus: how a species born in African landscapes could eventually be found across huge stretches of Eurasia, threading its way through forests, grasslands, river valleys and coasts. To understand that journey, we need to step back from the glow of the hearth and follow their tracks outward. Across continents, through bottlenecks of climate and geography, into a dispersal so large and long-lasting that it would set the stage for every human migration that followed. When you picture out of Africa, you might think of our own species, Homo sapiens, sweeping across the globe in the last 100,000 years. But the first big human dispersal out of Africa happened much earlier, and it wasn't us. It was Homo erectus. By the time our lineage takes the stage in its modern form, Homo erectus has already been living beyond Africa for well over 1 million years. They were, in a sense, the pioneers, the first hominin to turn Africa into a starting point rather than a prison. How did that happen? The story seems, at first glance, almost impossible. A bipedal ape, still new to controlled fire, with stone tools you could learn to make in a weekend napping workshop, somehow walking out of East Africa and turning up in places like Georgia, China, and Indonesia. To follow that trail, it helps to start with one of the most surprising sites we've ever found. Dmanisi in modern-day Georgia. Here, at the edge of the Caucasus Mountains, archaeologists uncovered skulls and skeletons that look unmistakably like early Homo erectus, small-bodied, small-brained by later standards, but with the long-legged, striding build you'd expect from a distance runner. The tools scattered around them are simple Oldowan-style flakes, not the later elegant handaxes we associate with classic Homo erectus in Africa. And the date? Roughly 1.8 million years ago. That's astonishing. It means that almost as soon as Homo erectus appears in the African record, around 1.9 to 2 million years ago, depending on which fossils you emphasize, some of them are already gone. Not extinct, just elsewhere. From Dmanisi, the evidence fans out. In Java, in what is now Indonesia, fossils of Homo erectus have been dated to at least 1.5 million years ago, and possibly earlier depending on how you interpret the sediments and tools. In northern China, sites like Nihewan Basin show stone tools and hominin remains from close to 1.6 million years ago. Across parts of the Middle East and South Asia, scattered finds hint at early presence as well. So it doesn't look like a single sprint across Eurasia, straight from Africa to the Pacific. It looks more like this, a slow, uneven seepage, following paths that opened and closed with the climate. This is where the idea of windows of opportunity becomes crucial. The world Homo erectus was walking into was not fixed. Over and over throughout the Pleistocene, climates pulsed, wetter, drier, warmer, colder. As those pulses rolled through, entire landscapes changed character. Deserts shrank when rainfall increased. Grasslands stretched like green highways when monsoon belts shifted. Forests retreated and advanced, opening and closing corridors. When conditions lined up just right, Africa and Eurasia weren't separate, hostile worlds. They were connected by what some researchers call green corridors. Imagine the corridors as bands of habitable terrain, belts of grass, scrub, open woodland, threaded with rivers and lakes. In some phases, one of those belts would run from East Africa up through the Nile Valley, or along the Red Sea and into the Levant. In other phases, a route might be easier along the Arabian coast, or through what's now the Sinai Peninsula. Move further north and east and you find other ribbons of opportunity, the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, the shores of the Caspian and Black Seas, the river systems of Central Asia, the Loess Plains and lake basins of northern China. None of these were permanent highways. They blinked on and off with each climate oscillation. But each time one lit up, a small group of Homo erectus could push a little farther, a few valleys beyond their parents, a few more days' walk away from familiar hills. Over hundreds of generations, those tiny shifts add up to continents. Coastlines, too, were probably crucial. Sea levels during the Pleistocene rose and fell dramatically. In low sea periods, what we see now as isolated islands in Southeast Asia were connected to the mainland in a larger landmass called Sunda. Rivers would have braided into rich estuaries, tidal flats, and mangroves full of shellfish, crabs, and fish. For a flexible omnivore with a basic toolkit, those zones are a buffet. Follow a river downstream. Pick up stone, crack shells, scavenge beached carcasses, trap fish in shallows. Move a little farther along the coast. Repeat. You don't need a plan that includes reach Indonesia in 10,000 years. You just need to keep moving toward the next patch of slightly better habitat. What does a traveller need in that world? First, mobility. We've already seen that Homo erectus had a body built for distance. Long legs, springy tendons, a foot structure tuned for walking and trotting over uneven ground. That kind of body doesn't just help you chase antelopes. It lets you cover 10, 20, 30 kilometers in a day without breaking down. Second, diet flexibility. An animal that can only eat one or two kinds of food is trapped by geography. A specialist grazer is tied to grass. A strict frugivore is tethered to fruiting trees. Homo erectus was the opposite of that. Evidence from cut-marked bones, isotopes, and the wear patterns on teeth suggest they were comfortable shifting between scavenged or hunted meat, marrow, fat, nuts, seeds, underground storage organs, and whatever local plants happened to be edible. Add in even intermittent use of fire, and suddenly marginal foods become usable calories. In a new valley, you don't have to wait for your favourite tree. You experiment with what's there. Third, social cooperation. A few individuals wandering off on their own don't establish a new population. To leave a lasting trace in the fossil record, you need breeding groups, not solitary explorers. That means small bands of Homo erectus, maybe 20 to 50 individuals moving in loose coordination, fissioning when resources were tight, fusing again when times were good, sharing knowledge of water sources, migration routes, dangerous cliffs, and hostile neighbours. Cooperation is what turns raw mobility into successful dispersal. A lone mother with children, cut off from others, is fragile. A group can rotate childcare, pool hunting efforts, defend carcasses from predators, and care for injured members long enough for them to recover. At Dmanisi, one skull belongs to an individual who had lost most of their teeth yet lived for years afterward. That survival almost certainly required group support, food sharing, patience, a tolerance for vulnerability. Those same social instincts that kept them alive at home would help them survive in unfamiliar terrain. How fast did all of this happen? Here, the evidence is patchy and interpretations differ. One view imagines something like a rapid wave. Homo erectus appears in Africa, and within a relatively short evolutionary window, perhaps a few 100,000 years, populations spread broadly across Eurasia. In this picture, the early Dmanisi group and the Asian Homo erectus fossils are part of a single sweeping expansion, with occasional pauses but no major retreats. Another view emphasizes multiple waves and back-and-forth movements. Under this model, small populations of early Homo erectus, or closely related forms, sometimes given names like Homo ergaster, leave Africa in pulses. Some groups establish themselves for a time and then die out when climates turn against them. Others hang on, adapt, and send out their own offshoots further east or north. Meanwhile, additional waves from Africa arrive later, bringing slightly different tool traditions or anatomical traits. The truth may lie between these extremes. The fossil and stone tool records suggest that dispersal was neither a single explosive colonization nor a perfectly smooth gradient. It was probably a series of expansions and contractions, like the breathing of a very slow animal. As climates warmed and corridors opened, populations grew and pushed outward. As conditions deteriorated, ranges shrank, groups fragmented, some local lineages vanished, and others retreated to refuges where resources remained. Over millions of years, this kind of ebb and flow doesn't just shape where a species lives, it shapes how long it can survive. Geographic spread is a form of insurance. A species confined to one region is at the mercy of local disasters, volcanic eruptions, epidemics, sudden droughts. Spread that same species across multiple regions, climates and habitats, and the risk is diluted. A catastrophe in one place may wipe out a regional population, but others, far away, continue. Homo erectus seems to have leaned into this strategy. By occupying Africa, parts of Western Eurasia, East Asia and Southeast Asia, they were, in effect, betting on many tables at once. Different subpopulations experienced different environments. Monsoon cycles in Asia, seasonal temperature swings at higher latitudes, tropical storms, and coastal variability along ancient shorelines. Those varied challenges applied different kinds of selection pressure. Some groups might have been pushed toward better cold tolerance, others toward more efficient use of plant foods, others toward improved coordination in hunting or scavenging. From the outside it looks messy and scattered. From the inside, for the species as a whole, it was a way to survive the long roll of Pleistocene climate dice. Not all those lineages lasted. Most didn't, but enough did, in enough places that Homo erectus as a species endured for nearly 2 million years. Their first big dispersal out of Africa wasn't a heroic march led by a visionary leader with a map in hand. It was an emergent property of their bodies, their tools, their social lives, and the ever-shifting pathways carved by rivers, coastlines, and climate. They walked when they could. They stayed when they must. They moved on when things changed, and wherever they went, they carried with them the same basic survival package: endurance, a wide palate, and a talent for cooperation. Those traits didn't just get them out of Africa, they set the foundation for something even more remarkable: the ability to live in many different kinds of worlds at once. Worlds that would test them in new ways, from steamy forests to cold steppe edges, and see just how far this adaptable fire-shadowed primate could go. To picture how Homo erectus lived, it helps to stop thinking of them as savanna apes and start thinking of them as edge dwellers, because when you look closely at where their bones and tools actually turn up, a pattern emerges. They're not locked into one kind of terrain. Homo erectus sites show up in open grasslands in East Africa, in more wooded patchy landscapes, near lakes, along rivers, on plateaus, in lowest plains, in northern China, even in environments that, in some phases, were closer to dense woodland or forest edge than textbook savanna. What ties these places together isn't a particular plant or animal. It's structure. Most of the time you find them in what ecologists call mosaic habitats, landscapes made of many small pieces stitched together. A stretch of open grass, a belt of shrubs, a tongue of woodland, a wetland pocket, a rocky outcrop, not endless prairie, not unbroken forest. Edges between things. Those edges are where life concentrates. At the border between grassland and woodland, you get grazing animals moving back and forth with the seasons, browsers slipping into cover, predators watching both sides. Birds, insects, fruits, tubers, seeds. The variety spikes where different microhabitats touch. For an omnivorous primate with stone tools, that's ideal. You don't want to specialize in a single niche that disappears when the climate shifts. You want a buffet where, if one resource fails, 3 others are close by. Imagine a day in that kind of world. Dawn breaks over open grass where herds have grazed through the night. If a predator kill happened nearby, there might be leftovers to scavenge: bones rich with marrow, scraps of meat, bits of hide. As the sun climbs, some animals retreat towards scattered trees and thicker brush. That's where certain fruits and leaves are, where birds nest, where small game hides. Down in a shallow valley, A stream snakes through reeds and mud flats. Aquatic plants, shellfish, maybe stranded fish inside pools at the end of the dry season. Beyond that, a rise of drier ground with scattered rocks, perfect for making tools and watching for danger. Homo erectus seems to have favoured exactly these kinds of flexible, layered environments. The presence of their tools and fossils near lakes and rivers, again and again, drives home another simple reality: water shaped almost everything. In the tropics and subtropics, you cannot live far from dependable water without serious technology. No wells, no pottery for long-term storage, no pumps or aqueducts. For Homo erectus, that meant rivers, lakes, springs and seasonal pools were the anchors of their world. Archaeological sites from East Africa are clustered around ancient lake margins and river terraces. In places like the Turkana Basin, you see repeated occupations along shifting shorelines. As the lake rose, fell and moved, so did the people. In Asia too, early Homo erectus is tied to basins and valleys where water collected. Nihewan Basin in northern China is essentially a patchwork of old lake and river deposits, preserving evidence of repeated visits and occupations over hundreds of thousands of years. Follow the water, and you're following Homo erectus. Water wasn't just for drinking, it concentrated animals, especially during dry periods. Herds had to come drink. Predators came to hunt the herds. Carcasses and bones washed into low spots. For a scavenger hunter with sharp stone flakes, a waterhole was a crossroads of opportunity. Aquatic and semi-aquatic foods also become accessible around water. Soft plant rhizomes you can dig with a stick, clams you can pry open, fish trapped in shrinking pools as dry season deepened. Even sporadic use of these resources could smooth out the lean times when land-based foods were scarce. So, if you mapped Homo erectus movements over a year, they probably looked less like straight lines across the open plain, and more like loops and arcs around dependable water, with occasional longer excursions between basins when conditions allowed. But where in all of this did they actually sleep? Here the archaeological record goes quiet. Stone tools and butchered bones are tough. They survive millions of years. Shelters do not. No intact huts. No tents, no campfires with clear hearth rings from 1.5 million years ago, except in a few disputed or heavily eroded contexts. Windbreaks built from branches, nests of grass, simple lean-tos, these vanish almost immediately once abandoned. We have to infer shelter from indirect clues. One clue is repeated use of certain spots. When we see thick layers of stone tools and animal bones accumulative in one small area over long periods of time, especially near water and raw materials, it suggests that groups returned again and again, perhaps using the same shade tree, the same overhang, the same slight rise that stayed dry when floods came. Rock shelters and cave mouths become more obvious in the later record, but even early on, any natural feature that broke the wind or provided overhead cover would have been valuable. Another clue is the climate itself. In some of the colder or wetter phases of their range, northern China in glacial intervals or higher elevations in parts of Eurasia, it's unlikely that naked apes simply huddled in the open every night and survived for generations. They may have used caves opportunistically. They may have constructed simple shelters from branches, piled vegetation and hides, the way many foraging peoples did until recent times. A few poles, an overhanging bough, a layer of grass, and suddenly a chilly, damp night is tolerable. But direct evidence for that is almost non-existent this far back. What we can say cautiously is this: wherever there was a combination of water, food, raw materials for tools, and at least some kind of sheltering feature, tree cover, a bank, a boulder field, a shallow cave, Homo erectus had what it needed to set up a temporary home base. Those bases didn't have to be permanent villages. Think of them more as recurring favoured spots in a seasonal round. You might return to the same lakeshore for several wet seasons in a row, spread out to uplands or forest edges when certain plants ripened, then regroup when herds migrated. This pattern, moving through a mosaic, exploiting edges, orbiting around water, becomes especially important when you plug in the climate. Throughout the lifespan of Homo erectus, the world's climate did not sit still. Glacial and interglacial cycles deepened. Monsoon belts shifted north and south. Some regions that started as woodlands opened into grasslands. Others that were once open became more forested. Lakes in the Rift Valley swelled and shrank. Coastlines crept out and then drowned again as ice built up and melted. A species locked into one habitat type would have been in constant danger. If you can only live in dense forest and the forest retracts, you either move with it if you can or you vanish. If you can only survive on vast open steppe and woodland invades, you're in trouble. Homo erectus sidestepped that trap by not specializing too tightly. Their home wasn't the savanna or the forest or the steppe. It was the boundary zones between them. When climate changes pushed the edge of the forest eastward, they could track that edge. When grasslands advanced down a valley, they could follow the new herds. When a lake dried into a series of shrinking ponds, they could pivot to the nearest river basin still flowing. Ecological breadth, the ability to use many kinds of habitats, and especially to thrive in mosaics, acted like a buffer against climate whiplash. Local populations certainly disappeared. Some valleys that were rich in one phase would have become barren in another. Bands that depended too heavily on a particular river or lake might have suffered badly when it changed course or evaporated. But across Africa and Eurasia as a whole, other groups of Homo erectus were living in slightly different worlds. Drier uplands, moister river corridors, coastal flats exposed by low seas. When one region turned harsh, another entered a more favourable phase. Because Homo erectus could make a living in all of these places, the species as a whole didn't have to match its fate to any single climate pattern or landscape. They weren't just walking far, they were living wide. And that wide ecological footprint, from grassy plains to wooded margins, from lake shores to forest edges, was one of the quiet reasons they could ride out almost 2 million years of planetary mood swings. In the next part, we'll look more closely at those mood swings themselves, the ice ages, the sudden droughts, the violent shifts that could turn a green corridor into a dust bowl, and how a creature armed with only stone, fire, and cooperation managed to survive the whiplash. When we talk about climate change in the time of Homo erectus, we're not talking about a slow, gentle warming over a few centuries. We're talking about the Pleistocene, a time when ice sheets the size of continents grew and shrank again and again, when sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters, exposing vast coastal plains, then rose, drowning everything, when regions that were once humid and green could turn, in a geological heartbeat, into dry, wind-blown dust. On long time scales, it looks like a sawtooth pattern, ice ages building up over tens of thousands of years, then crashing into warmer interglacials. But inside those big swings were smaller jolts, decades-long droughts, sudden wet pulses, storms that rearranged river systems, monsoon belts jumping north or south. To a species trying to raise children and find food day by day, this wasn't a background pattern. It was the stage on which every life played out. Climate variability stresses populations in two basic ways. First, by shrinking or shifting the places they can live. A valley that was once a fertile patchwork of woodland and grass can dry out, its river becoming a chain of muddy pools. A lake that anchored migration routes can overflow or drain, changing where animals move and where plant communities grow. Second, by making the future unreliable. If the rains no longer come on schedule, if fruiting seasons shorten or fail, if herds arrive late or not at all, then knowledge that worked for your parents may fail for you. Tradition becomes a weaker guide. So how does a species survive nearly 2 million years of that? Not by finding a perfect habitat and clinging to it, by staying light on its feet. Mobility was the first and most obvious strategy. Homo erectus had the body for it. Long legs, efficient hips, a ribcage and spine tuned for distance walking. They were not sprinters built for a single burst and collapse. They were endurance animals. When a lake in the Rift Valley retreated, they could follow its shrinking shoreline, then peel off toward the next basin. When grasslands opened a corridor across Eurasia during a cooler, drier phase, some groups moved out of Africa entirely. When forests crept down mountainsides during wetter intervals, other groups tracked those new edges. Instead of rooting themselves to one valley, they treated landscapes like networks of options. This kind of mobility wasn't random wandering, it was guided movement based on memory and on information shared inside groups. Some spots would have been known as good in drought years, others as good when the big herds come. Over time, different bands built mental maps of where to go when things turned bad. A dry spell didn't have to mean staying put and starving. It could mean packing up and walking to a basin where underground springs still fed a stream. But mobility only works if you can eat in many different ways along the route. That's where diet breadth comes in. Homo erectus was not a picky eater. They used meat when they could get it, from scavenging or hunting. They smashed bones for marrow. They likely cracked long bones and skulls of medium-sized animals, pulling calories from places many other scavengers left behind. They also dug for underground storage organs, tubers, corms, rhizomes that hide water and starch below the surface. They probably took eggs, insects, shellfish, and small vertebrates when opportunities arose. Seeds, nuts, seasonal fruits, anything that could be processed with teeth and stone. In wet periods they might lean more on plant foods along rivers and lakes, plus carcasses from animals that got bogged down or drowned. In dry phases they could shift toward tougher underground plants, and whatever animals still came to shrinking waterholes. The toolkit supported this flexibility. Oldowan and Acheulean technologies look simple compared to later stone industries, but they're surprisingly general purpose. A sharp flake can cut meat, scrape hides, slice plant stems, open tubers. A handaxe can butcher a carcass, crack open long bones, chop branches, dig. By carrying a small collection of multi-purpose tools, a band of Homo erectus could walk into a new patch of country and, within limits, make a living there. They didn't need a specialized beak for one kind of seed or a highly adapted gut for one kind of leaf. They outsourced part of their adaptation to stone. Technology also buffered them against short-term climate shocks. If a sudden dry spell killed off certain fruits, but drove more weakened animals to waterholes, a group with good butchery tools could pivot to scavenging and hunting. If predictable large-game opportunities declined, stone flakes and simple digging sticks could extract more value from plant foods and small animals. Over time, another buffer became just as important as tools, each other. Social buffering is the idea that, when environments are unpredictable, your best insurance isn't just stored food. It's stored relationships. We see hints of this even in the sparse record of Homo erectus. An injured individual surviving long enough for bones to heal suggests care, someone slowing down to stay with them, sharing food when they couldn't hunt. Sites with repeated use over long spans hint at shared knowledge of safe places, where groups could regroup when other areas failed. If one band had a bad year, illness, a failed migration, a local drought, connections to neighboring bands could mean exchanged mates, shared information about where herds had gone, maybe even sharing of meat at a rich kill. These networks, however loose, spread risk across space. And across that space, the demographic story was messy. Homo erectus didn't cover Africa and Eurasia as one continuous humming population. They lived in scattered bands, dozens of individuals at most, thinly spread and often separated by hundreds of kilometres. Climate whiplash hit these bands unevenly. A sudden dry phase might wipe out one small lake's resources, causing the local band to fragment or die. A nearby river valley, fed by a more distant watershed, might stay viable. A highland forest patch might shrink, pushing its inhabitants downslope into contact or conflict with others. In genetic terms, this is what's called a metapopulation, many small groups, some blinking out, others persisting, with movement between them over time. Local extinctions were almost certainly common, but they weren't the end of the species. When conditions improved in a formerly harsh region, when rains returned, when a river re-established its course, when grasslands recolonized an old plain, survivors from neighboring areas could move in. A new band could form in a place where the previous inhabitants had been gone for generations. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this constant pattern of local loss and recolonization produced resilience at the species level. The archaeological record, though, doesn't show this process smoothly. Instead, we see what look like gaps, intervals when, in a given region, Homo erectus seems to vanish from the sediments. No tools, no bones, nothing for tens of thousands of years, and then suddenly a layer with handaxes and flakes again. Sometimes, those gaps probably reflect reality. Conditions truly became too harsh or too unstable, and local populations disappeared. The land went quiet, at least for hominins. Other times, the gaps may be artifacts of erosion, of later rivers cutting away the layers we'd need, or of simple sampling bias. No one has dug in the one spot where a thin, short-lived occupation layer still lies buried. It's tempting to read smooth narratives into these absences. They left. They couldn't live here anymore, maybe. But it could also be that people were present in low numbers, leaving faint traces that haven't yet been found, or that haven't survived. What we can see when we zoom out is that the larger pattern holds Homo erectus appears, disappears, reappears across vast ranges, tracking opportunities as climates flickered. If you compare their story to that of more specialized animals, the contrast is striking. Many Pleistocene species are tightly tied to particular conditions. Cold-adapted megafauna that thrive on open steppe tundra. Forest-dependent browsers that need dense canopy. When climates shift too far too fast, those specialists run out of room. Their world literally shrinks away beneath them. Homo erectus, by contrast, made a living in hot, semi-arid basins and in cooler temperate zones, along lakes and rivers, in open grass and broken woodland, in lowland plains and upland edges. They didn't do any one thing perfectly. They did many things well enough, over a human lifetime, that might not look impressive. You walk a little farther this year. You eat more roots, fewer fruits. You spend more time along the river, less on the open plain. You visit a valley your grandparents only mentioned in stories, but over tens of thousands of years, those small adjustments add up to something powerful, a lineage that persists through rolling droughts, shifting forests, advancing and retreating ice. Flexibility, not specialization, is what beats the Pleistocene. And that flexible way of living, mobile, broad in diet, buffered by technology and social ties, resilient through local loss and recolonization, set the stage for everything that came after. In the next section, we'll look more closely at the social side of this, how cooperation, care, and the simple act of sticking together turned a clever primate into one of the great survivors in Earth's history. Try to imagine for a moment what a group meant to Homo erectus. Not a village, not a tribe with a name and a chief. More likely a loose band of related individuals, a few extended families travelling, foraging and resting together. Maybe 20-30 people. Sometimes fewer, sometimes during good times, a few more. In a world with big carnivores, unpredictable weather, and long stretches between reliable resources, simply not being alone was already a major adaptation. Living in groups brought three big advantages: safety, food, and information. Safety first. A single hominin on an open plain is an opportunity. Lions, saber-tooths, hyenas, packs of wild dogs, even big raptors if we're talking about children. Almost everything with teeth was better armed than Homo erectus. What they had instead was awareness. Many eyes scanning the horizon can spot a stalking predator sooner. Many bodies together can intimidate a solitary hunter, or at least make it think twice. Adults can move toward vulnerable juveniles, cluster around an injured elder, shout, throw stones, brandish burning branches if they had them. You can hear an echo of this even in modern humans. Our instinctive comfort in company in dark or exposed places. It's not hard to imagine where that came from. Then there's food. A lone forager finds what they find when they find it. A group searching in parallel across a wider radius brings in a more stable flow of calories. Someone digging for tubers might stumble on a cache of them. Someone else might flush a small animal from cover. Another might find a half-scavenged carcass at just the right moment. One day, one individual is lucky, the next day someone else is. Within a sharing group, those ups and downs even out. Over weeks and months, the feast or famine curve flattens. We don't have written rules from Homo erectus about who got what, but we do have some suggestive clues. Cut-marked bones at sites often show intensive processing, meat removed thoroughly, marrow extracted, sometimes even smaller bones broken. This implies that when a carcass was available, it mattered to get as much value as possible from it. That's the kind of work that goes faster and safer, with many hands. The simplest, most robust interpretation is that food moved within groups, parents feeding children, adults sharing some portion of a large kill, the injured or pregnant receiving help. Whether that sharing was obligatory, conditional, generous, or grudging is something we can't know. But without some form of distribution beyond the individual finder, it's hard to see how these small bands would have weathered bad stretches. The third advantage is information. On a landscape with shifting seasons and climates, knowledge is as vital as meat. Where did the herd cross last dry season? Which slope still had berries when the valley dried out? Where was that spring your grandmother talked about, the one that never quite ran dry? No single lifetime is enough to map all of this from scratch. Information has to be stored socially. When a band sits in the evening, resting sore feet and chewing tough food, that's when memory can be turned into guidance. Stories about where an aunt nearly got stuck in the mud at a shrinking lake. Warnings about a stretch of riverbank that collapsed after heavy rains. Observations that the big birds are flying a different way this year. We don't know what words they had, but we know they had brains capable of learning, and lives that made learning crucial. Even simple vocal calls, gestures, and shared routines could encode rich practical knowledge. Group living, then, wasn't just a pleasant background. It was a survival strategy. There's another piece of evidence that hints at how deep this ran: individuals who lived on after serious injury. At a site called Dmanisi in Georgia, an early Homo individual, likely related to Erectus, was found with almost no teeth and severe bone loss in the jaw. This person had survived for years after losing the ability to chew tough foods effectively. That survival implies that others were involved. They may have softened food, shared easier-to-eat parts like brain and marrow, or simply tolerated a slower companion on the move. We should be cautious here. One fossil doesn't prove a universal pattern of compassion. The injured might still have contributed in ways that made supporting them worth it, as a babysitter, as a source of knowledge, as an extra pair of eyes. Care can be pragmatic and still be care, but the broader pattern from Dmanisi and a few other sites with healed injuries suggests that abandonment at the first sign of weakness was not the rule. For Homo erectus, as for later humans, individuals were woven into a web of mutual dependency. That web may also have included early forms of division of labour, not in the modern sense of strict job titles, but in the simple fact that not everyone could do everything equally well. Pregnant individuals and those nursing infants likely ranged less widely, spent more time near safer spots, sheltered rocks, water, patches of reliable plants. Older individuals with accumulated knowledge but declining speed may have been especially valuable in these core areas, knowing where to find hidden resources, when to move, how to read subtle signs in the landscape. Younger, stronger adults could take on more dangerous or distant tasks, ranging farther to scout, confronting large carcasses where predators might still be nearby, exploring unknown routes when local conditions failed. Children in turn were growing into these roles, playing with sticks, imitating tool use, following adults on short trips, absorbing the unwritten curriculum of their band. Over time, this flexible division of labour makes a group more than the sum of its parts. It allows the band to perform multiple survival tasks simultaneously, watching children, processing food, scouting, and planning the next move, all within the same day. Childhood itself becomes a shared project. Human babies, even in their early forms, are costly. They take years to become independent foragers. In a risky environment, those years could easily be a liability. The solution, visible in many modern hunter-gatherer societies, and likely with deep roots, is cooperative child-rearing. Parents are primary, but not alone. Older siblings, aunts and uncles, grandparents, even non-kin who are closely bonded to the group can all contribute, carrying, watching, feeding, comforting. The energy cost of raising the next generation is spread across many shoulders. That distribution doesn't just keep children alive, it also creates time for some adults to experiment with new ways of doing things, time for adolescents to learn tool-making without immediate pressure to produce perfect results, time for knowledge to be repeated, practiced, corrected, reinforced. This is how traditions start to stabilize, when more than one adult knows how to shape a handaxe, or where the seasonal marsh forms after the rains, or which plants make you sick if you eat the wrong parts. That knowledge is less likely to vanish if one person dies. Social networks become archives. During scarcity and migration, these networks may have stretched beyond a single band. We don't have direct records of Homo erectus alliances, but the wide, repeated spread of their tools and bones suggests that populations were not completely isolated. Over generations, bands must have split, rejoined, merged, and exchanged individuals. A young adult might leave their birth group to join another, taking with them not only their genes but their habits and mental maps. A chance encounter at a waterhole might lead to wary observation, then cautious approach, then occasional sharing of space, and, perhaps, mates. These loose ties spread risk. If one band's territory failed, a local drought, an epidemic among animals, a fire that burned key foraging grounds, contacts with neighbouring groups, could be the difference between extinction and persistence, a place to move into, a partner to join. A new patch of river remembered by someone whose grandparents passed the story on. Across hundreds of thousands of years, this social fabric frayed and rewove itself countless times. Individual faces came and went, bands formed and disappeared. But the underlying pattern, cooperation, care, information sharing, and flexible roles remained. It wasn't a utopia. Conflict surely existed. Competition for waterholes, for carcasses, for safe resting places would have been real. But if Homo erectus had relied only on competition, they would have burned out quickly in the harsh Pleistocene. Instead, they leaned on belonging. Belonging turned a scattered set of small bodies into a long-lived lineage. It made every patch of ground they crossed a little less dangerous. every dry season a little less final, every piece of hard-won knowledge a little more likely to survive. And that, in turn, laid the groundwork for something even more subtle, the slow cumulative building of culture. In the next section, we'll look at how memory, tradition, and quiet innovation turned those social bonds into a kind of early cultural engine, long before anyone etched a symbol or painted a wall. If we strip the word down to its barest bones, culture just means this: patterns of behaviour that are learned, shared, and passed on. Not instincts, not one-off clever tricks. Routines and habits that survive the death of the individuals who first stumbled on them. By that minimal definition, Homo erectus almost certainly had culture. Not songs and myths in the way we think about them. Not painted caves and carved figurines, but a quieter, more practical culture, ways of walking through the world, ways of making and using things, ways of reacting to familiar problems. Imagine a child born into one of those bands. They do not start from zero. By the time they toddle after adults on short foraging trips, the group already has a repertoire. Preferred paths between water sources, usual sleeping spots in a territory, a particular way of cracking bones for marrow, a recognizable style of shaping a cutting edge out of stone. The child isn't inventing any of this. They are watching, copying, being corrected, being allowed to practice. Even a few years of this makes an enormous difference. Without tradition, every generation has to rediscover fire-friendly wood, learn the hard way which plants cause stomach cramps, test every cliff edge and river crossing through trial and error. Each error has a cost, sometimes a fatal one. With tradition, the dangerous experiments are amortized across many lives. Someone long ago ate the wrong tuber and spent a miserable night. The band remembered. That plant got added to the mental list of avoid, or prepare carefully. The rule got passed on in gestures, in aversive reactions, in the way adults pulled children away from certain leaves. Over hundreds of thousands of years, those tiny, practical rules form a kind of invisible instruction manual. That's what traditions do. They stabilize survival skills. A particular way of napping a Handaxe edge, a sequence of steps for butchering a carcass, a favoured route that hits 3 reliable patches of food in a single day's walk. Once these are shared across a group and repeated over time, they become defaults. You don't have to think them up from scratch. You just have to learn them well enough not to break them by accident. This conservatism can look boring from a distance. Acheulean Handaxes associated with Homo erectus and their close relatives change only slowly across enormous spans of time. For over 1 million years, humans in Africa, then Eurasia, kept making large teardrop-shaped stone tools with 2 carefully worked faces. To us, paging through a book of artifacts, it can feel like nothing is happening. But for the people living inside that tradition, the stability is a feature, not a flaw. The Handaxe design had been tested and retested and retested again. It worked as a general-purpose cutting and chopping tool. It could help butcher animals, process plant material, shape wood, and defend against threats. When your day-to-day survival already demands most of your attention, relying on a known good pattern is rational. It minimizes risky innovation, reduces waste, and frees up mental energy for other tasks. Yet tradition wasn't the whole story. Homo erectus also had to innovate. They did not live in a frozen, unchanging world. Climate swung back and forth. Grasslands advanced and retreated. Forest edges shifted. Rivers cut new channels. Animals migrated, evolved, disappeared. Every time a group pushed into a slightly different environment, their old rulebook needed editing. New prey required new tactics. A population that started exploiting more fast-moving game might find that their old ambush methods weren't enough. Over time they might tweak their tools, slightly narrower blades, sharper tips, different ways of holding or throwing them. New raw materials demanded new techniques. A group moving into an area with fine-grained chert instead of coarse basalt would discover that it fractured differently. Those who learned to exploit that property, creating longer, thinner flakes, sharper cutting edges, would have an advantage. That knowledge, once proven, would spread. Even subtle shifts could be triggers. A drought that made one traditional waterhole unreliable could force a band to range farther, experiment with alternative paths, pay closer attention to cloud patterns or animal movements. The first to connect a new indicator, a certain bird's call, a distant line of green on the horizon, to hidden water would be disproportionately valuable. If they survived and shared, that observation could harden into a tradition. Innovation, in other words, didn't float free. It was usually anchored to necessity. We shouldn't imagine Homo erectus as restless inventors constantly seeking novelty for its own sake. More likely, most of the time, most individuals were content to do what had worked before. Change tended to creep in at the edges, when old solutions failed, when someone noticed a slightly better way, when a band found itself somewhere with no tried-and-true recipe. Over thousands of generations, this dance between stability and occasional change produced something we can see clearly in the archaeological record: regional variation. Handaxes from East Africa don't look exactly like handaxes from Western Europe. Tools from early Erectus sites at Dmanisi differ in average shape and size from those found much later in Java. Some sites show more emphasis on large cutting tools, others more on smaller flakes and scrapers. It's tempting to arrange these differences into a ladder, primitive to advanced, simple to complex, as if some regions were behind and others ahead, but that's our bias talking. A more grounded interpretation is that these variations were mostly adaptations, not progress. Different animals to hunt, different plants to process, different rock available, different weather patterns dictating how long a tool needed to last before it could be replaced. A thick, sturdy handaxe that works well for breaking long bones in one region might be overkill in another, where smaller game and soft plant foods dominate. A lightweight flake tool that excels at fine slicing might be preferred in a group that relies more on quick butchery and fast movement. Each region, each band, was tuning the same basic inherited toolkit to local conditions. Culture, in this sense, wasn't a single ladder climbing upward. It was more like a branching tree of traditions, each rooted in the past, each reaching in slightly different directions depending on where it grew. What tied all of these branches together was cumulative know-how. No one generation of Homo erectus had to reinvent stone breaking, or say fire use, or how to read the seasons. They inherited a baseline from the previous generation, modified it slightly in response to their own conditions, and passed that on. Even small improvements once absorbed into the shared repertoire could persist for tens of thousands of years, a slightly more efficient way to hold a core before striking it, a better sequence for processing a carcass so that meat, marrow and hide were all exploited before scavengers closed in, a safe order for introducing children to risky tasks, first carrying embers, then tending coals, then feeding a fire. Each addition made the band and the lineage just a little more resilient. This slow, cumulative cultural evolution is one of the best candidates for explaining how Homo erectus lasted as long as they did. Genetic changes are relatively rare and slow. Ecology can change abruptly. A lineage that depends only on biology to keep up will often lose the race. But a lineage with even modest culture, traditions that preserve useful behaviour, and occasional innovations when conditions demand it, can adapt on a different timescale. Years and decades, not only millennia. Homo erectus seems to have occupied that middle ground. Not yet the explosive symbolic culture of later Homo sapiens, but no longer animals relying solely on instinct and individual learning either. They were living in a world where memory extended beyond a single life, where solutions could accumulate, where a clever tweak learned by a grandmother could echo, faintly but really, in the behaviour of her descendants 100 generations later. That quiet engine of tradition plus innovation didn't make them immortal. No species is, but it did give them something close to a superpower for their time, the ability to meet a changing world with more than just bodies, with habits, with shared memory, with culture, long before anyone would have recognized the word. In the next section, we'll look at how far that engine could take them, and why, after 2 million years of persistence, even Homo erectus eventually stepped off the stage. Extinction sounds like a sharp word. It makes you imagine a single terrible moment. A comet, a plague, a volcano. One day they are there. The next day they are gone. For Homo erectus, it almost certainly didn't happen that way. If you could watch their last few 100,000 years on fast forward, what you'd see would look less like a sudden crash and more like a long, complicated fade-out. Little pockets of erectus hanging on in some regions. Other pockets changing, blending, being replaced by new kinds of humans. Populations splitting, shrinking, moving, and sometimes meeting groups that, strictly speaking, were no longer quite the same species. From the outside, hundreds of thousands of years compressed into a few minutes, the pattern would be clear. But from the inside, for the people actually living it, there was no sign flashing the end. There was just life going on. Until, finally, it didn't. To understand why, we have to wind the clock forward from the time when Erectus was at its best. For much of its history, Homo erectus had a good deal going. They were built to walk long distances. They could handle hot, open country better than almost any mammal their size. Their tools, especially those Acheulean handaxes and flakes, were versatile. Their social traditions let them cope with droughts, shifting herds, and slow climate swings. For a long stretch of the early and middle Pleistocene, those advantages lined up well with the world they lived in. Then the world changed again. After about 1 million years ago, climate swings didn't just continue. They intensified. Glacial and interglacial periods became more extreme. Cold snaps bit harder. Warm phases could be unusually wet in some regions, strangely dry in others. Sea levels rose and fell, sometimes by more than 100 meters, exposing land bridges and then drowning them again. For a species spread across Africa, Western Asia, China, and island Southeast Asia, this meant constant rearrangement of the playing field. Grasslands opened, then closed. Forest patches appeared, then vanished. Migration routes for prey animals shifted. Some regions that had once been good habitats for Erectus became less forgiving, more seasonal, more erratic. A flexible, mobile generalist can handle a lot of that. But not everywhere, not forever, especially when something else starts to happen. New humans arrive. By around 800,000 to 600,000 years ago, in Africa and parts of Western Eurasia, fossils begin to show faces and skulls that don't fit neatly into the classic Erectus pattern. Brains are larger on average, brow ridges and faces are still robust, but the overall shape is changing. Many researchers group these fossils under names like Homo heidelbergensis or archaic Homo. Labels differ, and specialists argue over where exactly to draw the lines, but the broad picture is simple. In some regions, descendants of early Erectus were evolving into something new. You can think of this as local upgrades pushed by local pressures. In Africa, populations living through repeated climate swings seem to have been under strong selection for flexibility, planning, and social coordination. Bigger, more energetically costly brains were only worth it if they paid back in better survival. Over time, those brains did seem to get bigger, the faces a bit more like ours. In Europe and Western Asia, some of these mid-period humans are on the road that will lead to Neanderthals. In Africa, and later in parts of the Middle East, others are on the road that will lead to Homo sapiens. Meanwhile, far to the east, in places like Java and maybe parts of China, more classic Erectus forms persist. For a long time, this creates a patchwork. In one region, you might have a population that looks more like the old Erectus pattern. In another, you have bulkier, big-brained people that might later be called Heidelbergensis. There isn't a single moment when someone wakes up and says, "We are no longer Homo erectus. We are something else." Evolution doesn't work with names like that. It just keeps selecting for what works. That brings us to one of the subtler points about this long fade. Homo erectus didn't start failing. The world just started selecting for different strengths. For millions of years, being a long-legged, heat-adapted walker with a solid but not enormous brain and a conservative toolkit was a winning combination. It let Erectus spread farther than any earlier hominin, from African savannas to Georgian hillsides to Indonesian river valleys. But as climates whipped back and forth faster, and as some regions grew colder or more seasonal, other strategies began to pay off more. A shorter, stockier body with immense strength and a wide rib cage turned out to be excellent for glacial Europe. That's the Neanderthal template emerging. Brains with ever more capacity for planning, abstraction and complex social life proved especially useful in fluctuating African environments. That's the early Homo sapiens path taking shape. In Asia, yet another branch, the Denisovans seem to have adapted to everything from tropical islands to high-altitude plateaus. In each of these regions, local descendants of earlier humans, some of them once comfortably lumped under Erectus, were sculpted by conditions that demanded more than the old solutions. And then there were the quieter killers. Disease, for example, almost never leaves a fossil trace. But as human population networks grew more complex, as groups ranged wider and occasionally met, pathogens could ride along. A band of Erectus that had been isolated for tens of thousands of years might have little immunity to a disease carried by a more densely connected population of later humans. Even a modest illness could hit hard in a small group, where every adult's labour counted. Demographics mattered too. Big-brained later humans likely had longer childhoods, more extended families, and possibly more elaborate cooperative childcare. That can be a burden, but it can also stabilise birth rates and survival. If Homo erectus in some regions were living in smaller, more thinly spread bands, with less capacity to buffer bad years, then even small differences in survival could add up. A few more children surviving to adulthood here, a few more elders living long enough to teach there. Over thousands of years, that's the difference between a lineage expanding and one slowly thinning. Competition played a role as well, though we should be careful with the image. This wasn't necessarily a constant war of extermination. More often it would have looked like this. Two human groups using the same valleys and riverbanks, one with slightly more efficient hunting strategies, slightly better communication, slightly more flexible planning. When a drought hit, that group could find and share scarce resources a bit better. They might outcompete the other for key waterholes or animal herds without any deliberate attempt to wipe them out. Over generations, one population grows, the other shrinks. Eventually, the smaller one might be absorbed entirely, through interbreeding and cultural mixing, or simply vanish from that area as young adults drift toward the more successful group. This kind of replacement is as much about marriage and migration as it is about conflict. When we look at the genetic legacy of later humans, that seems to be the pattern. Modern people outside Africa carry Neanderthal DNA. Many in Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA. That means our ancestors didn't just replace those groups in a clean sweep. They met, lived alongside, and had children with them. For classic Homo erectus, the genetic trail is murkier, partly because we have fewer good fossils with recoverable DNA. But given the pattern, it wouldn't be surprising if at least some erectus populations blended into later groups rather than disappearing in isolation. So the disappearance of Erectus likely involved several overlapping processes. In some places, their descendants simply evolved into new forms we call by different names. In other regions they were outcompeted by these newer forms and slowly replaced. In still others they may have been absorbed by gene flow, their distinct anatomical pattern dissolving into a wider human pool. Layered on top of that are accidents of history. A key refugium, a valley, an island, a patch of forest that had carried a small Erectus population through previous bad times might have been lost to a specific flood, a volcanic eruption, or a shift in sea level that cut off migration routes. With such small, scattered groups, a few unlucky events can erase entire branches of a lineage. What we don't have, at least so far, is a smoking gun. We don't know the last band of Homo erectus. We don't know their names, their stories, or the exact year their children's children were the last ones, whose bones would still look erectus to a modern paleoanthropologist. Some researchers suspect that the final strongholds were on islands in Indonesia, maybe Java, with dates pushing as late as about 100,000 years ago. If that's right, then somewhere in those forests and along those rivers, Erectus may have overlapped in time with early Homo sapiens moving through Southeast Asia. Did they meet, trade, compete, ignore each other? We don't know yet. Future discoveries could change this picture dramatically. A new cave site with well-dated fossils might show a late Erectus population persisting in some overlooked region. Ancient DNA techniques are improving. One day we might pull a partial genome out of a tooth or a bit of bone, currently just labelled archaic Homo. That could tell us whether genes we now think of as modern human or Neanderthal actually have deeper Erectus roots. Better climate reconstructions might show exactly which droughts, cold snaps or sea level rises pinched which populations when. That could link specific environmental crises to the thinning or survival of particular lineages. For now, though, the most grounded story we can tell is this. Homo erectus didn't die in a single catastrophe. They were gradually outpaced in some regions, transformed in others, and blended away in still more. Their tried and true package of traits, so successful for so long, met a world where other packages worked slightly better. But disappearance isn't the same as erasure. The walking bodies, the long-distance ranging, the basic social cooperation, the habit of passing on tools and tricks through teaching, all of that fed into the humans who came next. When we finally arrive at the moment where our own species, Homo sapiens, leaves Africa and begins to meet its cousins, we are meeting a world already shaped by Erectus and its descendants. In the next section, we'll slow down for a moment, step back from the details, and look at the evidence that lets us tell this story at all, and why, even with so many gaps, there is value in tracing the long arc of a species that almost learned how to last forever. Up to this point, we've been following a kind of outline of Homo erectus's life. A body shaped for distance and heat, a brain big enough to learn, but not yet as oversized as ours. A toolkit that stayed surprisingly stable for over 1 million years. A food strategy that mixed scavenging, hunting, and sheer opportunism. Fire may be held and managed, may be discovered again and again. Social bonds strong enough to raise slow-growing children and remember what worked. And finally, that long, uneven fade as newer kinds of humans appeared. Those are the pillars that made a 2-million-year run possible. But they're still, in a way, the view from very far away. From that distance, you can say Acheulean Handaxes, long-distance walking, climate adaptation, and it all sounds neat and orderly, like labels on drawers. Now that we've laid out the structure, it's worth pausing and asking a softer, stranger question. What did any of this actually feel like? Not in the abstract, but from inside one of those bodies. What did it feel like to wake up in a Homo erectus camp on a cool morning 100,000 years ago, somewhere along a river in what is now Kenya or Georgia or Java, to stretch legs that could carry you for 20 miles, to smell smoke or wet earth, or animals on the move, to know, not in words but in habits and memories, which direction held water, which ravine sometimes trapped antelope, which old fig tree was worth checking at the right season. When we talk about social life or cooperation or care for the injured, we're really just putting names on patterns. The living reality would have been people, however we define people for that time, sharing food, watching each other's children, arguing, comforting, grieving, telling one another, in whatever language they had, where the lions were yesterday. The hard part is that almost none of that leaves neat footprints. What we actually have are bones, stones, ash, and sediments. Gaps that are much larger than the pieces, and scientists trying, very carefully, to listen to what those small pieces are saying without forcing them to tell a story they don't support. Almost everything we've talked about so far is an inference. A long, low skull with thick brow ridges and a narrow pelvis tells us something about body shape and brain size. Leg bones with particular proportions tell us about walking and running. Wear patterns on teeth hint at the kinds of food they chewed. Cut marks on animal bones, lying in particular patterns, hint at butchery, scavenging or hunting. A pile of stone flakes that all break in similar ways suggests a shared method for making tools. Handaxes scattered across continents, but made to similar proportions for over 1 million years, suggest a tradition, a learned, taught pattern that outlived any single generation. A healed skull fracture or a mended limb tells us that someone was cared for long enough to recover. They didn't just die the first time they couldn't walk or feed themselves. In a few places, blackened sediments with altered minerals tell us that fire was burned there, again and again, in a way that looks more like controlled use than like natural wildfire. From details like these, archaeologists begin to build careful, layered stories. They don't just look at one site, or one bone, or one layer of ash. They compare hundreds of sites dated with multiple methods. They look for repeated patterns across time and space. They ask, do we see cut marks on top of carnivore tooth marks? Or the other way around? Are the stone tools scattered randomly or clustered in ways that suggest workspaces? Are the animal bones from young, fit individuals, which might suggest active hunting, or from a wide mix of ages, which might suggest scavenging? Each answer nudges the picture one way or another. But those answers are never complete. They arrive with ranges and probabilities, error bars and alternative explanations. That's why, when you listen closely to specialists, you hear so many words like maybe, likely, consistent with, one interpretation is. It isn't that they don't know anything. It's that they know exactly how much they don't know, and they try to leave room for surprises. That's one reason the Homo Erectus story feels so dreamlike. We can outline the shape of their world. We can point to footprints literally and figuratively. We can stand in the same valleys and caves where they once cooked or butchered or huddled against a storm. But the inner texture of their days, what jokes sounded like, what stories they told to calm a frightened child, what it felt like to lose someone and still have to get up the next morning to find water that lies just beyond the edge of the evidence. What we have is a conversation between data and imagination with strict rules. You can imagine, but you have to keep that imagination on a short leash, tied firmly to bones, tools, sediments, and the behaviour of living animals. That's what good prehistory writing tries to do, to honour both the evidence and the mystery. If you've been enjoying drifting along that border between what we can know and what we can only carefully picture, this is probably a good moment to mention something we've been working on. We've turned stories like this one about Homo erectus and many other chapters of deep time into a book designed for exactly the kinds of evenings you're having now. It follows the same approach you're hearing in this episode, grounded in current research, honest about uncertainty, slow and gentle enough to fall asleep to, but rich enough to leave you thinking the next day. If you're curious, you can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount running for listeners of the channel. No rush, no pressure, just something to explore when you're awake. If you'd like this kind of journey in a form you can hold, mark up, and come back to. And that brings us back to the last arc of our story tonight. Because under all the details, the handaxes, the brain sizes, the climate charts, there's a simple thread running through Homo erectus 2 million years: resilience. Not resilience as a slogan, but as a day-by-day practice. Waking up to a world that never stopped changing. Learning over and over how to move when water shifted, when herds migrated, when forests shrank or grasslands opened. Passing on tricks and routes and habits through countless generations. Making bodies, tools and social ties do just enough to hold back the edge of hunger and fear. As we head into the closing stretch, we're going to lean into that thread. What does the long experiment of Homo erectus tell us about how to endure? About how much flexibility matters, and how much simple, persistent cooperation matters. About what it means to live in a species that doesn't last forever, but can leave a legacy that echoes long after its last bones have turned to stone. To answer that, we'll gather up everything we've seen: the anatomy, the tools, the fire, the social life, the long fade, and trace out the survival blueprint they left behind. A blueprint we are, in some quiet way, still carrying within us. If you lay all the pieces of Homo erectus' story on the ground and step back a bit, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a detailed instruction manual, not a neat list of steps. More like a faint blueprint, the kind architects sketch before they add the measurements. Broad shapes, arrows showing direction, notes in the margins: this part can bend, this part must hold. The first line on that blueprint is mobility. Erectus bodies were built to move: long legs, narrow hips, strong ankles, springy tendons. They weren't sprinters, they were steady, durable travellers. Over generations that meant something simple but profound. When conditions changed, they could leave. Water sources dried up, herds shifted their routes. A volcanic plain turned to ash. Instead of fighting to hold one small patch of ground, Homo erectus could follow the gradients of survival, down river valleys, along coastlines, through forest edges and open savannas, into cooler zones when things got too hot, and back out when ice crept down. That habit of moving turned geography into a kind of safety net. Failure in one place didn't have to mean failure everywhere. Populations could stretch, thin out, regroup. Frontiers weren't barriers, they were options. The second line is adaptability. Mobility is useful only if you can actually live in the new places you reach. Erectus seems to have done exactly that, not by specializing, but by refusing to specialize too tightly. They occupied hot, dry grasslands in East Africa. They lived in cooler, more seasonal landscapes in Georgia. They reached island Southeast Asia with its forests and coasts and volcanic hills. In each of those environments, they found a workable way to be Homo erectus without changing into something else overnight. Sometimes that may have meant hunting more, sometimes scavenging more, sometimes cracking open nuts and tubers, sometimes fishing or gathering shellfish, sometimes relying on fire if they had it, sometimes simply enduring nights with nothing but body heat and shelter. They didn't have one perfect strategy, they had a toolkit of strategies and enough cognitive flexibility to shift the proportions. That's what adaptability looks like in deep time. Not magic intelligence, but a willingness baked into bodies and habits to keep trying new combinations until something fits. The third line on the blueprint is tools. We tend to think of Acheulean handaxes as symbols of stability. They hardly change in their basic outline for over 1 million years. But looked at another way, that very stability is what made them powerful. A standardized tool that everyone knows how to make is like a shared language, but in stone. A young individual could watch a few times, practice on scrap rock, and eventually reproduce the same familiar teardrop shape that their grandparents had used. Within that framework there was room for nuance, thicker, heavier axes for chopping, thinner, sharper ones for butchery, smaller flakes for delicate work, local raw materials, local tweaks, always small variations on a theme that still made sense to anyone who'd grown up in that tradition. And it likely wasn't just hand axes. Simple wooden spears, digging sticks, carrying slings, perhaps containers made of skins or woven plant fibers, things that rarely fossilize would have extended their reach into the environment even further. The key point is that Homo erectus didn't just have tools. They had tool habits, techniques that were learned, remembered and refined over lifetimes. Technology in the literal sense of organized knowledge of how to do things. That brings us to the fourth line, social learning. A brain the size of early Homo erectus isn't enormous by our standards, but it's already large for a primate. Combined with a long childhood that gives you many years when small, observant eyes can watch what older individuals do. If you picture an erectus camp, you might see not just people using tools, but people teaching tools, adjusting a grip, correcting a strike, handing over a half-finished piece to let a learner feel the right angle of pressure. Information moved along those lines, from older to younger, from skilled to less skilled, from group to group when they met and watched each other work. That social learning smoothed over random bad luck. If one group had a bad year, others that had seen their tricks could keep those tricks alive. Knowledge in that sense became part of the survival system, every bit as much as muscle and bone. The fifth line is the flexible diet. Under a microscope, the wear on erectus teeth and the traces left on animal bones suggest a species that didn't insist on a single narrow menu. They took meat when they could, sometimes scavenged, sometimes hunted. They cracked long bones for marrow. They likely dug for tubers, stripped bark, chewed fibrous plants, maybe collected nuts and fruits when seasons allowed. Near coasts and rivers, they may have added fish or shellfish. This kind of omnivorous, opportunistic feeding isn't as glamorous as imagining heroic hunters bringing down giant animals every week. But in shifting climates, it's much safer. If you can eat a little bit of everything, and figure out which everything is available right now, famines become less absolute. Lean years are still hard, but not necessarily fatal to an entire lineage. Put those 5 lines together: mobility, adaptability, tools, social learning, and a flexible diet, and you have something like Homo erectus' survival blueprint. Move when you must, adjust when you can. Extend your body with simple, reliable technology. Teach what works. Eat whatever the land, the water, and your ingenuity can give you. From that angle, their 2-million-year run isn't a mystery at all. It's what happens when a species hits on a combination that's robust rather than fragile. Of course, much of that picture is still stitched together from scattered clues. We don't know exactly how often they used fire, or how many separate times different groups may have discovered and lost it. We don't know how rich their vocal communication was, how many distinct sounds they could string together, or how far they could carry a story. We don't know the full range of their tools, because wood and fibre almost always vanish. We don't know how often groups met peacefully, trading mates and knowledge, and how often they fought. We don't know what they called themselves in whatever proto-languages they might have used, or what they believed about the sky or death, or the strange sparks of lightning on the horizon. Those uncertainties aren't a failure of science. They're the normal state of trying to read a past that's hundreds of thousands of years deep, using fragments that survived by luck. And the mystery is still alive. New excavations continue to turn up surprises. Footprints on ancient lake shores, butchered bones in unexpected places, hints that fire may have been controlled earlier than we thought, evidence that some populations lingered in certain regions far longer or vanished sooner than previous timelines suggested. Every time a new site is dated more precisely, or a sediment layer is reanalyzed with more sensitive techniques, the outline of the erectus blueprint shifts a little. Sometimes it becomes sharper. Sometimes a piece we thought was solid turns out to be more tentative. That's part of why this story can feel so soothing to drift through at night. You're listening in on a conversation that isn't finished. A patient, careful, ongoing attempt to reconstruct lives that ended long before our species existed. The answers matter, but there's no rush toward a final, definitive conclusion. For our own lives, Homo erectus offers a quiet kind of reflection. We too live in a world that won't sit still. Climate shifts, sometimes on scales much faster than we'd like. Resources move. Technology changes the landscape and then changes it again. The Erectus blueprint doesn't tell us what to do about any of that. But it does offer some gentle reminders. It suggests that being able to move physically, mentally, socially is safer than trying to freeze the world in place. That learning from one another and passing on what works is a deeper form of security than any single invention. That eating a varied diet, not just in food but in ideas and skills, makes us less brittle when one source fails. It also reminds us that no species lasts forever, and yet legacies can. We probably carry a thin thread of Homo erectus genes in our deep ancestry. We certainly carry their solutions: bipedal bodies tuned for distance, brains wired for learning, hands perfected for tools, social lives built around long childhoods and shared care. Every time we migrate, adapt to a new job or climate, learn a craft from someone older, or cook a mixed meal from whatever is available, we're echoing strategies that kept bodies like ours alive through ice and drought and heat and uncertainty. As you settle more deeply into rest, you might let that thought sit near the edges of your mind, far back behind you, across a chain of generations so long that no language has numbers for it. There were small groups of Homo erectus, somewhere out under unfamiliar stars, doing their quiet best to wake up, move, learn, and endure. You don't need to remember their details. Your bones and nerves already do. If you'd like to wander further into that deep past on another evening, whenever you're awake and curious, and if this kind of gentle journey through prehistory has helped you relax tonight, it would mean a lot if you'd tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It helps this little community keep growing, and it tells the algorithms that more people might want a softer kind of history. If you feel like sharing, you can also tell us where you're listening from. What part of the world is wrapped around you as you drift off? Reading those quiet check-ins from different countries and cities is one of the ways we're reminded that, for all our differences, we're still one wandering, adaptable species. For now, though, you don't have to do anything at all. You can let the story of Homo erectus fade into the background, like a campfire at the edge of hearing, a long experiment in resilience, stretching out behind you. A blueprint written in motion, in memory, in the simple, stubborn act of getting through one more day. Whenever you're ready, you can follow them into sleep,